Saint Pierre Vast. After 14 days in hospital, and as long on leave, I went back to the regiment, which was now in the line near Deux Nuits, quite close to the well-known Grande Tranchée. After my arrival, it remained 2 days there, and the same time in the old mountain town of Hattonchâtel. There we entrained at Mars-la-Tour for the Somme region once more. We detrained at Bohain again and went into quarters at the village of Brancourt nearby. This was a neighborhood we often touched upon in later days. It was agricultural, and yet there was a loom in nearly every house. The inhabitants did not appeal to me. They were dirty and of very low moral development. I was billeted on a cottage where lived a man and his wife and their daughter. I must own that in return for my money they made me most excellent dishes of eggs. The daughter told me over to the first cup of coffee that she was going to drink a good cup of coffee with Poincare after his return, by which she meant give him a piece of her mind. I have never heard anyone so fluent in abuse as this Fila Hospitalis, particularly on the topic of a neighbor, whom she accused of having lived in a certain street of Saint Quentin. At cette pelure, cette pomme de tour pourrie, j'étais sur un fumier. C'est la crème de la crème. She sputtered while she raged around the room, stretching out her hands like claws in the vain search for an object on which to vent her wrath. In the morning, when this Rose of Brancourt was busied making butter or some other domestic matter, she looked unbelievably uninviting. Yet, in the afternoon, when it came to parading the village street with pride or visiting her friends, the ugly grub had turned into the splendid butterfly. I always observed with some mistrust a large box of rice powder that never left the table, for it seemed to me to be a complete substitute for soap and water. One day, the father begged me to forward an indictment to the town major complaining of a neighbor who, not content with taking him by the throat and giving him a good beating, had shouted, "Demandez pardon," while threatening him with death. Little observations of this kind gave me the comforting assurance that national pride, even in France, is not a quality of the masses. 2 years later, when we returned to our native land after honorable and exacting warfare, the knowledge of this helped me to get over the remarkable reception that some of our own people gave us. Il y a des cochons partout, as the English officer had justly remarked to me in front of the trenches at Monchy. The second company was now under command of Lieutenant Bauge. We spent our days here in the happy atmosphere of good fellowship. I must own that we often drank heavily, until, indeed, we treated the whole world as no more than a laughable phantom that circled round our table. There were usually uproarious sounds from the room occupied by our batmen. Those who had never known the brief spells that separate one murderous battle from another may hold up their hands at us if they please. In any case, we were glad to indulge ourselves with our men, with every hour of debauch that life would yield while we were still within its circle. I should not be taken for a dipsomaniac, though I mention drink so often. I have never flouted the time-honored and social rights of the bottle. At this same time, both before the war and since, I have often gone for months without drinking at all. But at the front one came out of the line covered with mud and in bad temper. To have the few days' unrest taken up in training, and then the night came in the mess, and the present was blotted out and only memory and hope were lit up. All the devastation of every kind that surrounded one was seen in the light of humor and in a state of bliss, however fleeting it might be, and was finally lost altogether in the light-hearted independence of time that attends upon every torpor. One broke through time, menacing and oppressive as it was, and rejoiced for an hour or two in a boundless world. The war left one with two memories, as I am sure every outspoken soldier of it will agree, that were always recurring. One, when one was faced with the worst moments it had to offer. The other, when the bottle went round as madly and merrily as it ever did in times of peace. It was only because these black and red threads were interlaced in fairly equal proportions that the experiences of the war were not intolerable. For the coming spell on the line, I was appointed as scouting officer, and with a scout troop and 2 NCOs was under the orders of the division. On the 8th of November, the battalion moved in pouring rain to Gonlieu. There the scout troop was detached to Learmont and put under the command of the divisional intelligence officer, Captain Bockelman. The captain, with his 4 scout officers, 2 observation officers, and his adjutant, was quartered in the priest's house. There we lived very happily together in comfortably furnished rooms. Our predecessors took over the divisional front. We had to go up the line every second night. Our task was to ascertain where the front line ran and to see the communications were maintained, so that if the need arose we should be able to take the troops into the line and carry out orders in an emergency. My sphere of action was a sector left of the St. Pierre Vast Wood, and immediately in front of the so-called Nameless Wood. The first night, after nearly drowning myself and crossing a marsh flooded by the Tortelle, I got into a very thick cloud of phosphine shell gas, and scurried back with weeping eyes to Vaux Wood. On the way back I fell into one shell hole after another, as I could see nothing through the misted eyepieces of the mask. On the 13th of November, hoping for better luck, I set out again on my second tour of the line. My orders were to ascertain that touch was maintained between the shell holes that constituted the front line. I struggled to my goal along a chain of posts concealed in holes in the ground. The shell hole line deserved its name. A plateau in front of the village of Rancourt was pockmarked with innumerable miniature craters, which here and there were occupied by 2 or 3 men. The monotony of the scene, where nothing was heard but the whistle and crash of shells, filled the mind with the dread of its utter desolation. After some time I lost touch with the line of shell holes and went back in case I walked into the French. Soon after, I came upon an officer I knew in the 164th Regiment, who warned me not to stay any longer now that dawn was breaking. So I hurried on through Nameless Wood, stumbling into deep shell holes and over uprooted trees and through the almost impassable tangle of branches that covered the ground. When I left the edge of the wood, it was daylight. Before me lay an expanse of shell holes without a sign of life. I stopped short, for, in modern battle, stretches of ground where not a man is to be seen are always suspicious. Suddenly, a shot from an unseen sniper got me in both legs. I flung myself into the nearest shell hole and bound the wounds with my handkerchief, for, needless to say, I had forgotten my field dressing. A bullet had passed through my right calf and grazed my left. I crept back into the wood with the utmost caution, and from there limped over the shell-shot ground to the dressing station. Shortly before this I had had an example of the little incidents on which the chances of war turn. I was making for the crossroads about 100 meters ahead of me, when an officer in command of a working party whom I had known in the 9th Company called out to me. We had scarcely been talking for a minute, when a shell struck the crossroads where but for this chance encounter I should probably have been at that moment. After dark, I was carried on a stretcher to Nurlu. Captain Bockelman was kindly waiting for me with a car. We were proceeding along the Chausse in the light of the enemy searchlights, when the driver suddenly applied the brakes. A dark obstruction barred the way. It was an infantry section with its NCO, which had just fallen victim to a direct hit. It seemed as though death had united them in a peaceful sleep. I had to be taken into the cellar of the priest's house, as Learmont was just receiving its evening benediction. The same evening I was moved to the Villeret Field Hospital, and thence to the War Hospital at Valenciennes. The hospital was installed in the gymnasium near the station, and accommodated 400 severe cases. A funeral procession with muffled drums left the main entrance day after day. The whole misery of the war was concentrated in the spacious operating theater. The surgeons carried on their sanguinary trade at a row of operating tables. Here a limb was amputated, there a skull chiseled away, or a grown-in bandage cut out. Moans and cries of pain sounded through the room in the flood of remorseless light, while nurses in white hastened busily from one table to another with instruments and dressings. The soldier who after such a sight goes back under fire with ardor unquenched has indeed withstood a test of nerve, for every fresh and terrible impression claws itself into the brain, and is added to the prostrating complex of imaginings that make the moment between the rush and the burst of a shell even more frightful. Next to my bed, a sergeant major who had lost a leg lay dying. In his last moments, he woke from delirium and got the nurse to read him his favorite chapter of the Bible. Then, in a voice scarcely audible, he asked all his ward companions to forgive him for having so awakened them from sleep by his delirious ravings. And then, just before he died a few minutes later, he tried to cheer us all up with an imitation of our orderly's comic dialect. I was glad when after 14 days I was able to leave this abode of piled-up agonies, with my wound half healed. I had read with pride, meanwhile, of the magnificent and successful attack of the Fusiliers on the St. Pierre vast wood. The 111th Division was still holding the same front. There were several explosions as my train trundled into Epée. The ruins of goods trucks lumped together showed that it was no joking matter. "What is going on here, I say?" asked a captain sitting opposite me. He had the fresh and rosy air of having been exported straight from home. Without wasting time for a reply, I tore open the door and took cover behind the railway embankment. Fortunately, they were the last ones, and only a few horses were wounded. As I could not walk very well, I was given the post of observation officer. My field of observation was over the falling ground between Nerlou and Moslernes. I had a periscopic telescope built into a shelter, and with this I kept a lookout in the front line that I already knew well. My job was to ring up the division in case of heavy fire, colored lights, or any other unusual events. All day long I crouched freezing on a chair behind the glasses in the November mist, with nothing to vary the monotony except an occasional call to test the wires. If the wire had been broken, I had to have it mended by my breakdown squad. Apart from this, I had to do nothing but wait for the moment of attack. The modern battlefield is like a huge, sleeping machine with innumerable eyes and ears, lying hidden and inactive, ambushed for the one moment on which it all depends. Then from some hole in the ground a single red light ascends in fiery prelude. 1,000 guns roar out on the instant, and at a touch, driven by innumerable levers, the work of annihilation goes pounding on its way. Orders fly like sparks and flashes over a close network, spurring on to heightened destruction in front, and bringing up from behind a steady stream of fresh men and fresh materials to fling into the flames. Everyone feels that he is caught in a vortex which draws him on and thrusts him with unrelenting precision over the brink of death. Every 24 hours I was relieved by another officer, and betook myself to Nerlou, where fairly comfortable quarters have been rigged up in a large wine cellar. I often think of those long, meditative November evenings, which I spent smoking my pipe alone at the hearth of this barrel-shaped vault, while outside the mist dripped from the bare trees in the park, and at long intervals a re-echoing broke the stillness. On the 18th of November, the division was relieved, and I went back to the regiment, now on rest in the village of Fresnoy-le-Grand. There I took over the command of the 2nd Company in place of Lieutenant Bauge, then on leave. The regiment had 4 weeks of undisturbed rest in Fresnoy, and everyone did his best to enjoy it to the full. Christmas and New Year were celebrated by the companies with great festivities, at which beer and grog flowed in rivers. There were exactly 4 men left in the 2nd Company who had spent the previous Christmas with me in the line before Monchy. I was billeted on a French rentier, in whose house I shared the so-called salon, and 2 bedrooms with Feinrich Gornick and my brother Fritz, who was spending 6 weeks with the regiment as cadet. We made ourselves very merry over the worthy married couple who kept an Argus-eyed watch over their plush furniture and alabaster vases, and over their stack of wood in the yard, and who lived on terms of unceasing animosity with the batman. In this little retreat, the bottle went round faster than ever. At night, when walking late through the narrow streets, one heard the sounds of carnival in every billet. Everything in wartime goes without reckoning, and hence came the preference of the soldier of the front for alcohol in its most concentrated forms. Our relations with the civilian population, too, were, to a great extent, of an undesirable familiarity. Venus deprived Mars of many servants. Needless to say, we were at once put on a footing of old Prussian discipline, and it said a great deal for officers and men that after 14 days the regiment was once more at its old level. There was an inspection by the commander of the division, Major General Sontag. On this occasion the regiment was honored for its valiant conduct in the attack on St. Pierre Vast Wood, and distinguished by a number of decorations. As I marched past the general at the head of the 2nd Company, I observed that Colonel Van Oppen appeared to make some remark about me to the general. A few hours later, I received orders to report at divisional headquarters, where the general handed me the Iron Cross of the 1st class. On the 17th of January, 1917, I was sent from Fresnoy on a 4 weeks company commander's course at Cisnon, near Leon, where there was a French maneuvering ground. Captain Funk, who was in command of our detachment, made the work exceedingly pleasant. He understood to an exceptional degree how to put the spirit above the letter of the law, and to interest us in the matter at hand. The catering was certainly the sorriest I had ever experienced in the course of the war. During the whole 4 weeks, there was seldom anything put on the table of our gigantic mess room but watery boiled Swedes. At the same time, the work was by no means light. The Somme retreat. On my return to the regiment, which had been for some days in the line near the ruins of Villers-Carbonel, I was given temporary command of the 8th Company. Our rest place was Devizes. On the march from there to the line, one had to cross the plain of the Somme near the village of Brie and St. Christ. The dreary devastation of these places in the midst of the melancholy marsh country used to put me in a peculiarly sorrowful mood, as dark fragments of cloud chased across a moonlit sky, and the eerie interplay of light and shadow heightened the impression of chaos. During the latter part of the time our front was exposed to numerous English attacks, connected with the great evacuation of the Somme area, for which we had made the most careful preparations. The enemy raided nearly every morning to ascertain whether we were still there. The following are a few of the experiences of those days. 1st of March, 1917. During the morning, there was a great artillery activity owing to the clear weather. In particular, a heavy battery, with the help of balloon observation, pretty well flattened the section of the trench occupied by No. 3 platoon of my company. In the afternoon, in order to mark up any alteration of the line on my map, I splashed along to No. 3 platoon through the utterly waterlogged, unnamed trench. On the way, I saw a giant yellow sun rush down to the ground, trailing a black streamer behind it. An airman had attacked the unpleasant balloon and shot it down in flames. He got back, in spite of a storm of fire. In the evening, Lance Corporal Schnau came to report that he had detected the sound of pickaxes, 4 days past, underneath his section's dugout. I forwarded the report and was sent a pioneer detachment with a listening apparatus. But our suspicions were not confirmed. Later, we heard that our whole position had been undermined. On the 5th of March, a patrol approached our trench in the early morning and began to cut our wire. Lieutenant Eisen, with a few men, hurried off to warn the nearest post and threw bombs. The enemy patrol then took to flight, leaving 2 men behind them. One, a young lieutenant, died immediately. The other, a sergeant, was severely wounded in the arm and leg. It appeared from papers found on the officer that he belonged to the Royal Munster Fusiliers. He was very well clothed, and his features, though distorted in death, were intelligent and energetic. It affected me to find the addresses of several London girls in his pocketbook. We buried him behind our trench and put a simple cross at his head. I saw from this that all patrols need not end so fortunately as mine had done in days past. Next morning, the English, after a short artillery preparation, attacked the front of the company, commanded by Lieutenant Reinhardt, with 50 men. The enemy crept up to the wire. Then one of them, who had a striker attached to his cuff, made a light signal in order to silence the English machine guns, and the whole party threw their last bombs and advanced on the trench. The men received them in such a masterful fashion that only one of them got into the trench. He ran straight through to the second line, and there, when he made no reply to summons to give himself up, he was shot. Only a lieutenant and a sergeant got through the wire. The officer, though he wore a steel shirt under his uniform, was accounted for by a bullet point blank from Reinhardt's revolver that drove the whole steel plate into his body. The sergeant had both legs nearly torn off by a bomb. Nevertheless, he clenched his short pipe between his teeth with stoical calm until he died. Here, as always, whenever we encountered the English, we encountered brave men. During the morning of this success, I was strolling along the trench and saw Lieutenant Pfaffendorf, who was controlling the fire of his trench mortar with a periscopic telescope from a fire step. I had scarcely joined him when I saw an Englishman walking along over the top behind the third line of the enemy trenches. I seized the nearest rifle, sighted it at 600, got the man in the tip of the foresight, and then, aiming a bit in front of his head, I pulled the trigger. He went 3 steps, and then fell on his back as though his legs had been knocked from under him. After a few movements of his arms, he rolled into a shell hole where, with the glass, we could see his brown sleeves showing up for a long while after. On the 9th of March, our front was properly plastered with shells. I was awakened in the early morning by the heavy firing, and, seizing my revolver, went, dazed with sleep, into the trench. When I pulled aside the ground sheet at the top of the dugout steps, it was still as black as pitch. The bright flashes of the guns and the showers of earth woke me up in no time. I ran through the trench, but not a soul did I see till I came to a deep dugout, where a group of men crowded on the steps like hens crowding together in the rain, with no one in command. On such occasions, the Prussian way is the best. Pitch into the men, and so get yourself going too. I took them with me, and soon made the trench look lively. I was delighted to hear little Hambrook's piping voice somewhere along the trench, occupied in the same way I was. When the firing died down, I went back to my dugout in a bad temper, and there I was further ruffled by a telephone call from headquarters. "What the hell is up? Why have you been all this time coming to the phone?" Keeping in touch is no doubt most important, but fighting, after all, is action first and last. After breakfast there was more of it. This time high explosives were slowly but incessantly being plunked down in front of our noses. At last it became boring, so I paid little Hambrook a visit by an underground gallery, and after seeing what he had to drink, sat down with him to a game of 7 and 4. We were a little upset once by a giant crash. It sounded as though a drunken gang came tumbling over each other down the steps. Lumps of earth clattered through the door and down the stovepipe. The dugout staff had got hit, and the timber revenant was shivered to matchwood. Sometimes a suffocating smell of bitter almonds blew down the shaft. Were they shooting prussic acid at us? Well, good luck to them. I had to leave the dugout once. Indeed, I made 4 attempts in all, owing to constant interruption by the shells. Immediately after, the batman bounced in with the announcement that the latrine had disappeared beneath a direct hit. "Well," said Hambrook, "you do have the devil's own luck." The fire ceased towards evening. I went along the trench in the mood I always experienced after being heavily shelled, a mood like the relief one feels after a violent storm. The trench looked pretty bad. Stretches of it were entirely filled in. 5 dugout shafts were smashed up. Several men were wounded. I went to see them and found them all fairly comfortable. There was one man killed. His body lay in the trench covered with a ground sheet. A long splinter had torn his left hip away, though he was standing right at the bottom of the dugout steps. In the morning we were relieved. On the 13th I was entrusted by Colonel von Oppen with the honorable task of holding the company front with a patrol of 2 sections until the whole regiment had crossed the Somme. Each of the 4 sectors of our front was to be held by a similar patrol under the command of an officer. The officers, starting from the right flank, were Reinhardt, Fiska, Lorek, and myself. The villages we passed through as we marched to the front line had the appearance of lunatic asylums let loose. Whole companies were pushing walls down, or sitting on the roofs of houses throwing down the slates. Trees were felled, window frames broken, and smoke and clouds of dust rose from heap after heap of rubbish. In short, an orgy of destruction was going on. The men were chasing round with incredible zeal, arrayed in the abandoned wardrobes of the population, in women's dresses with top hats on their heads. With positive genius they singled out the main beams of the house and, tying ropes round them, tugged with all their might, shouting out in time with their pulls, till the whole house collapsed. Others swung hammers and smashed whatever came in their way, from flower pots on the window ledges to the glass work of conservatories. Every village up to the Siegfried line was a rubbish heap. Every tree felled, every road mined, every well fouled, every watercourse dammed, every cellar blown up or made into a death trap with concealed bombs. All supplies or metals sent back, all rails ripped up, all telephone wire rolled up, everything burnable burned. In short, the country over which the enemy were to advance had been turned into an utter desolation. The moral justification of this had been much discussed. However, it seems to me that the gratified approval of armchair warriors and journalists is incomprehensible. When thousands of peaceful persons are robbed of their homes, the self-satisfaction of power may at least keep silence. As for the necessity, I have, of course, as a Prussian officer, no doubt whatever. War means the destruction of the enemy without scruple and by any means. War is the harshest of all trades, and the masters of it can only entertain human feelings so long as they do no harm. It makes no difference that these operations which the situation demanded were not very pretty. On the 13th, I took over, with my 2 sections, the front that the 2nd Company now left to me. During the night, a man with the ominous name of Kirchhoff was killed by a shot through the head. This unlucky shot happened to be the only one fired by the enemy during several hours. I did all I could to deceive the enemy as to our strength. A few shovelfuls of earth were thrown over the top, now at one point, now at another, and our machine gun had to fire a few shots first from the left and then from the right. Nevertheless, our fire sounded extremely thin when a low-flying scout crossed the line, or a working party traversed our front behind the enemy's trenches. Consequently, patrols appeared every night at one point or another and set to work tampering with our wire. On the last day but one, I nearly met a sorrowful end. A dud shell from an anti-aircraft gun came hurtling down and exploded on the traverse against which I was innocently leaning. The rush of air sent me flying into the entrance of the deep dugout exactly opposite, where I came to in a state of utter stupefaction. On the 17th, in the early morning, we could tell that an attack was imminent. In the English front line, usually unoccupied due to the mud, was to be heard the clatter of many feet. The laughter and shouting showed that they were a strong party and well fortified from within. Presently, dark figures approached our wire. They dispersed under our fire, and one collapsed with a cry and was left behind. I withdrew my men to the entrance of the communication trench, and was kept busy in illuminating our front, now suddenly under artillery and trench mortar fire with Varay lights. As the white soon gave out, we made a fireworks display with colored ones. When 5 o'clock came, the hour at which, according to orders, we were to evacuate the trench, we quickly blew up the dugouts with bombs, insofar as they were not already provided with infernal machines, some of which we had ingeniously constructed. During the last hours, I had not dared to touch any box or door or bucket in case I might go up in the air. At the appointed time, all the patrols, some of them already involved in bombing engagements, retreated toward the Somme. We were the last to cross the river, and then the bridges were blown up by an engineer detachment. The drum fire still raged away on our front, and it was some hours later when the first enemy patrols appeared on the Somme. We retired behind the Siegfried position, then still being constructed. The battalion was quartered in the village of Lancourt on the St. Quentin Canal. I occupied, with my batmen, a comfortable living cottage where household goods were stored away in chests and cupboards. I should like to put on record, to show what sort of fellows ours were, that nothing I could say would induce my batman, the trusty Nig, to make his bed in the warm sitting room. He insisted all the time on sleeping in the cold kitchen. This attitude of reserve, which is typical of the lower Saxon, made the relations between officers and men work very smoothly. The first evening, out on rest, I invited a party of my fellow officers to drink mulled wine, spiced with all the spices left behind by the owner of the house, for our rear guard had earned the praise of all our superior officers, and 14 days' leave as well. In the village of Fresnoy. My leave, on which I went a few days later, was this time not curtailed. I find in my diary this brief but eloquent record. Leave spent very happily. Need have no reproaches on that score after my death. On the 9th of April, 1917, I returned to the 2nd Company, then quartered in the village of Merengues, not far from Douai. The pleasure of my return was dashed by an unexpected alarm, which for me had the peculiarly unpleasant consequence that I had to ride the company charger to Beaumont. Through rain and sleet, I rode at the head of the transport that slipped all over the paved road till we reached our destination at 1 in the morning. When I had seen to my horse and the men as well as I could, I went in search of quarters for myself, but there was not an unoccupied corner to be found. At last, a commissariat orderly had the excellent idea of offering me his bed, as he had to sit up for telephone calls. While I was pulling off my boots and spurs, he told me that the English had captured Vimy Ridge and a lot of ground from the Bavarians. I could not help observing, in spite of his hospitality, that he was not at all pleased to find his quiet village headquarters turned into an assembly point for the fighting troops. The next morning, the battalion marched in the direction of heavy firing to the village of Fresnoy. There, I received orders to set up an observation post. I took a few men and explored the western outskirts of the village and found a cottage, in whose roof I had a lookout post made that commanded the front. We took the cellar as our dwelling place, and in the course of making room there we came upon a sack of potatoes, a very welcome addition to our scanty provisions. My batman now roasted me potatoes every evening with salt. Lieutenant Gornick also, like a true friend, sent me a large parcel of Leberwurst and some red wine. He had found them among the stores left behind in haste at Villerval, which had already been evacuated, but which Gornick was holding as an outpost with one platoon. I at once equipped an expedition furnished with perambulators and similar means of transport to secure this treasure. Unfortunately, it returned empty-handed, as the English were already in full strength at the edge of the village. Gornick told me later that after the discovery of a large cellar of red wine, a drinking bout had started, which, in spite of the attack that had been made on the village, had been extremely difficult to bring to a close. On the 14th of April, I was given the task of organizing an intelligence clearing station in the village. For this purpose, I had dispatch riders, bicyclists, telephone and light signal stations, underground telegraph wires, carrier pigeons, and a chain of Varay light posts placed at my disposal. I looked out a suitable cellar with a deep dugout, and returned for the last time to my dwelling place on the western edge of the village. During the night, I fancied I heard a crash now and then, and shouts from my batman, but I was so dazed with sleep that I only murmured, "Oh, let them shoot," and turned over, though the whole place was thick with dust. Next morning, I was awakened by little Schultz, Colonel von Oppen's nephew, who was shouting, "I say, don't you know yet that your whole house has been blown to blazes?" When I got up and surveyed the damage, I observed that a shell of the heaviest caliber had been planted on the roof, and that the observation post, indeed the whole house, was no more. If the velocity had been only a trifle slower, the hit would have got us into the cellar and plastered the walls with us, so that in the nice sang of the trenches we might have been scraped off with a spoon and buried in the pot. Schultz told me what his orderly said to him when he saw the ruins of the house. "There was a lieutenant in there yesterday. Better have a look and see whether he is there still." My batman was beside himself at the way I had slept through it. During the morning, we shifted our quarters into the new cellar. On the way, we were nearly hit by the church tower, which the engineers were unobtrusively blowing up in order to deprive the enemy of an easy mark. In a neighboring village, they had forgotten to warn a post of 2 men who were keeping a lookout from the top of the tower there. By a miracle, they were retrieved uninjured from the debris. We furnished our roomy cellar very passively, for we collected what we could from mansion or cottage, and what we had no use for, we burned in the stove. During the first day, there was a succession of duels to the death in the air. They ended nearly every time in the defeat of the English, as Richthofen's battle formation was circling over the neighborhood. Often, 5 or 6 machines were driven down or shot down in flames. Once we saw the pilot thrown from his machine and fall to the earth as a separate black speck. There were dangers, too, in staring up into the sky. A man of the 4th Company was killed by a falling splinter that hit him in the neck. On the 18th of April, I paid a visit to the 2nd Company in the line. It held a salient in front of the village of Arlux. Lieutenant Boge told me that he had only a single casualty for a long while, as the English shelling was so methodical that it allowed them to sidestep and avoid it every time. After I had wished him all the best, I had to leave the village at a gallop on account of the continuous shooting by the enemy's heavy guns. I stopped 300 meters behind Arlux to watch the clouds that rose from each hit. They were red or black according to whether brick walls had been pounded or garden soil flung up, and among them was the delicate white of exploding shrapnel. When a few whiz-bangs began falling on the footpaths that connected Arlux with Fresnoy, I abandoned the pursuit of further impressions and decamped at full speed, in case I might be slain, as the stock phrase then was in the 2nd Company. I was often making expeditions of this kind, sometimes as far as the little town of Henin-Letard, for during the first 14 days, in spite of my large staff, there was not a single report to communicate. From the 20th of April, Fresnoy was shelled by a 30.5 centimeter gun. The shells came over with a perfectly infernal hiss. After each hit, the village was veiled in a huge reddish-brown cloud of picric acid gas. Even the duds caused a small earthquake. A man of the 9th Company, who was surprised by one of them in the courtyard of the chateau, was flung over the trees in the park and broke most of his bones in the fall. In the afternoon, the village was shelled with all calibers. In spite of the danger, I could not tear myself from the attic window of my house. It was a breathless sight to see how small parties and dispatch carriers chased over the shelled area, often throwing themselves flat, while the ground was flung up on every side of them. When I went into the village after this, one more cellar had been hit and set on fire. The salvage operations recovered only 3 bodies. Near the cellar lay one on its face, with the uniform in shreds. The head was torn off, and the blood flowed into a puddle of water. When the stretcher-bearer turned the body over in order to remove any valuables, I could not help seeing that on the stump of the arm there was only a thumb. The enemy artillery became more active every day and left no doubt of an early attack. On the 27th of April at midnight, I had the following telephone message. 67 from 5 a.m., which meant in our code, utmost readiness for an alarm at 5 a.m. So I lay down again, hoping to be all the better prepared for the expected exertions. However, as I was just falling asleep, a shell hit the house and blew in the wall of the cellar stairs and threw the masonry into the cellar. We jumped up and hurried into the dugout. As we crouched on the steps in the light of a candle, disconcerted and weary, the sergeant of my light signaling section, whose post, together with 2 valuable signaling lamps, had been smashed up in the afternoon, came rushing in. "Sir, the cellar of number 11 has had a direct hit, and some of the men are still buried in the ruins." As I had 2 cyclists and 3 telephonists in number 11, I took some men and hurried to their help. I found a lance corporal and a wounded man in the dugout, and was given the following account. When the shells began to fall suspiciously near, 4 of the 5 occupants of the cellar decided to go down into the dugout shaft. One of them went straight away. One stayed where he was in bed, while the remaining 3 delayed to pull on their boots. The most prudent and the least, as so often in war, came off the best. The first had not a scratch, and the second had a splinter in the thigh. The 3 others were caught by the shell, which came through the cellar wall and exploded in the opposite corner. After this narration, I lit a cigar and went into the smoke-filled cellar. In the middle of it there was a heap of wreckages, bedsteads, straw mattresses, and various pieces of furniture, all in fragments and piled up nearly to the roof. After we had put a few candles on ledges of the walls, we set to work. Catching hold of the limbs that stuck out from the wreckage, we pulled out the dead bodies. One had the head struck off, and the neck on the trunk was like a great sponge of blood. From the arm stumps of another, the broken bones projected, and the uniform was saturated by a large wound in the chest. The entrails of the third poured out from a wound in the belly. As we pulled it out, the last splintered board caught in the ghastly wound with a hideous noise. The orderly made a comment on this, and was reproved by my batman with these words: "Best hold your tongue. In such matters talking nonsense serves no purpose." I took an inventory of the valuables found in them. It was a horrible job. The candles flickered red in the vaporous air, and as the two men handed me pocketbooks and silver objects, it seemed as though we were engaged in some dark and secret work. The fine yellow plaster dust fell on the faces of the dead and gave them the fixed look of waxed figures. We threw coverings over them and hurried out of the cellar after taking up the wounded man in a ground sheet. With the stoic advice to set his teeth, we carried him through a whirl of shrapnel fire to the dressing station dugout. When I got back to my dwelling place, the first thing I did was to have a few cherry brandies. The experience I'd been through had touched my nerve. Soon we were being violently shelled once more, and with the example before our eyes of what artillery fire can do in cellars, we made all speed into the dugout shaft. At 5:15 a.m., the fire increased to an incredible violence. Our dugout rocked and trembled like a ship on a stormy sea. All round resounded the rending of masonry and the crash of collapsing houses. At 7 a.m., I received a message by light signal addressed to the 2nd Battalion. "Brigade requires immediate report on the situation." After an hour, a dispatch carrier brought back the news. "Enemy taken Arlux and Arlux Park. Ordered 8th Company to counterattack. No news so far. Rochelle, Captain." This was the only message that my tremendous apparatus of transmission had to deal with during all 3 weeks of my time in Fresnoy. Though certainly, it was a very important one. And now that my activity was of the utmost value, the artillery fire had put nearly the whole organization out of action. Such were the results of over-centralization. This surprising information explained why we had heard rifle bullets, fired at no very great range, clattering against the walls of the houses. We had scarcely realized the great losses suffered by the regiment, when the shelling was renewed with increasing fury. My batman was standing, the last of all, on the top step of the dugout stairs, when a crash like thunder announced that the English had at last succeeded in knocking in our cellar. The trusty nig got a squared building block on the back, but was not hurt. Above, everything was shot to blazes. Daylight came to us past 2 bicycles squeezed into the dugout entrance. We made ourselves as small as we could on the lowest step, while heavy explosions and the din of falling masonry convinced us of the insecurity of our refuge. By a miracle, the telephone was still working, so I explained the plight we were in to my chief at the division, and received orders to withdraw my men into the dressing station dugout close by. After packing up what it was most essential to take with us, we set about leaving the dugout by the second and only remaining exit. In spite of my peremptory order, backed up by unequivocal threats, the telephone staff, which was not much used to war, hesitated so long to venture out of the protection of the dugout into the shell fire, that this exit too was smashed in with a crash by a heavy shell. Luckily, no one was hit, only our little dog howled miserably, and from that moment was never seen again. We pushed aside the bicycles that barred the way out through the cellar, and, creeping on all fours over the heaps of debris, got into the open through a narrow crack in the wall. We did not pause to observe the incredible change that these few hours had produced in the village, but ran out of it as fast as we could. The last of us had scarcely left the yard gates when the house got another tremendous hit. A compact belt of fire covered the area between the edge of the village and the dressing station dugout. Light and heavy shells with direct and delay action fuses, duds, empty cases, and shrapnel combined to produce a nightmare of acoustic and optical effects. Through it, passing to the right and left of the witch's cauldron seething in the village, the reserves were marching up. In Fresnoy, the shells were sending the earth in fountains as high as a church's towers. Each seemed bent on outdoing its predecessor. As though by magic, one house after another was sucked into the earth. Walls collapsed, gables fell, and bare rafters were flung through the air to mow the roofs of neighboring houses. Clouds of splinters danced above the whitish swaths of vapor. Ear and eye hung as though entranced upon this dance of destruction. We spent 2 days in a painfully confined space in the dressing station dugout, for besides my men, there were the staffs of 2 battalions, 2 relief detachments, and the indispensable corps troops. Naturally, the constant coming and going in front of the entrances was observed by the enemy. Soon the range was got to a yard, and at intervals of a minute, shells fell on the track outside, where there were casualties all the time. Indeed, the shouts for stretcher-bearers never ceased. I lost 4 bicycles which we had left outside, owing to this disagreeable bombardment. They were scattered to the 4 winds, in various states of contortion. Stark and still, wrapped in a ground sheet, Lieutenant Lemire, the commander of the 8th Company, lay at the entrance, his large horn spectacles still on his nose. His men had brought him here. He was shot in the mouth. His younger brother was killed a few months later in exactly the same way. On the 30th of April, I handed over to my successor of the 25th Regiment, by whom we were relieved. We made our way to Fleurs, the rendezvous of the 1st Battalion, leaving the much-shelled lime kilns, Chez Bontemps, on our left. We went quickly on through the afternoon sunshine along the path to Beaumont. Our eyes rejoiced again in the beauty of the earth. We drew in the intoxicating breath of spring, thankful to have escaped the intolerably crowded confinement of the dugout. With the thunder of guns in our rear, my sympathies were with the poet. Surely the day that God has given has better uses than to kill. In Fleurs, I found the quarter allotted me in the possession of some staff sergeant majors, who, under the pretext that they had to keep the room for a certain Baron von X, refused to give it up to me. They failed, however, to reckon with the overstrained nerves of a worn-out front-line soldier. I told my men to smash in the door, and after a brief hand-to-hand engagement, under the eyes of the owner of the house, who, much alarmed, hastened to the scene in his dressing gown, we sent the gentleman flying down the stairs. My batmen carried politeness to such lengths that he threw their trench boots after them. After this assault, I took possession of the warm bed, surrendering half of it to my friend Kuss, who was wandering round without a billet. Sleeping in a bed after so long a time did us so much good that we woke next morning in all our pristine vigor. As the 1st Battalion had come off the lightest and the casualties of the recent days of fighting, we were in excellent trim as we marched to Douai Station. From there we went by train to the junction of Busigny. We were to have some days' rest in Suresnes, a village in the neighborhood. The population was friendly, and we had good quarters. On the very first evening, the sound of happy foregatherings were to be heard from many of the houses. These drink offerings on the morrow of well-fought fights count among an old soldier's happiest memories. And though 10 out of 12 had fallen, still the last 2, as sure as death, were to be found on the first evening of rest over the bottle, drinking a silent health to their dead companions, talking and laughing over all they had been through. For dangers past, an old soldier's laugh. For those to come, a full glass, though death and the devil grinned there, as long as the wine was good. Such has ever been the custom of war. It was the officers' mess more than all that made me appreciate this. It was here, among the spirits of the undaunted dead, that the will to conquer was concentrated and made visible in the features of each weather-beaten face. There was an element at work here that the very horror of the war underlined and even spiritualized, an element one seldom found among the men with whom one lay in the shell holes. Sporting joy in danger, and a chivalrous impulse to see things out. And to say the least of it, I have never in this much reviled circle heard one faint-hearted word. My batman came next morning and read me the orders. From these it appeared that I was to take command of the 3rd Company. It was in this company, in the autumn of 1914, that Hermann Lons, the Lower Saxon poet, fell. Against Indians. On the 6th of May, 1917, we were once more on the march to the now familiar Brancourt, and on the following day we went through Montbrun, Rheims-Court, and Jeancourt into the Siegfried Line, which we had left just a month before. The first evening was stormy. Heavy rain pattered down without ceasing onto the flooded ground. Soon, however, a succession of bright, warm days reconciled us to our new station. I enjoyed the wonderful country undisturbed by the white puffs of shrapnel and the leaping cones of the shell bursts. Indeed, I scarcely noticed them. In those years of increased activity, the signs of an offensive were as much a part of the spring as primroses and opening buds. Our lines formed a crescent in front of the St. Quentin Canal. Behind us was the famous Siegfried Line. I could never tell why we had to occupy the narrow, unfinished trenches in the chalk, when behind us lay this magnificent line. The front line wound through an idyllic meadowland shadowed by small groups of trees and beautified now by tender colors of spring. We could move about with impunity behind and in front of the trench, for our front was protected by a belt of outposts pushed forward to the depth of a kilometer. These posts were a thorn in the enemy's side, and not a night went by for many weeks that he did not try to dislodge them either by cunning or force. Our first spell in the line was, however, passed in welcome quiet. The weather was so fine that the men slept out on the grass. On the 14th of May we were relieved by the 8th Company, and, leaving the burning St. Quentin on our right, proceeded to our rest place, Montbrun, a large village that so far had suffered very little from the war and therefore had very comfortable quarters to offer. On the 20th, as company in reserve, we occupied the Siegfried Line. The weather was gorgeous, and day after day we sat in the numerous arbors built in the sides of the trench, or bathed in the canal, or boated on it. The objection to occupying a trench otherwise so ideal lies in the frequent visits from superior officers, a pleasure very little esteemed in the line. In any case, my left wing had no cause to complain of being too safe. It extended nearly to the village of Belinglis, already seriously nibbled at, and on the very first day one of my men got a shrapnel bullet wound in the right buttock. When I hastened to the scene of the disaster, he was seated in great content on his left side, awaiting stretcher bearers, and filling in the time with an enormous slice of bread and jam. On the 25th of May we relieved the 12th Company in Ascension Farm. This farm, formerly a large estate, was occupied in turns by each of the 4 companies in the line. There were 3 machine gun positions at different points in our rear, and these had to be manned by sections in rotation. These strong points distributed behind the line, and covering each other like squares on a chessboard, were the first experiments in an elastic scheme of defense. The rest of the men were sent forward on working parties every night. The farm lay 1,500 meters at most behind the front line. Nevertheless, the buildings, surrounded by a well-timbered park, were still entirely intact. As there were deep dugouts under construction, there were plenty of men there. The red may-tree avenues in the park and the charm of the surroundings gave our life there something of the cheerful enjoyment which the Frenchman means by his verre de champagne, in spite of the nearness to the front. A pair of swallows had nested in my bedroom. Before it was light, they started on the noisy business of feeding their brood. In the evenings I took my stick from the corner and wandered along the narrow paths that went up and down through the hilly country. The neglected fields were scented with wildflowers. Here and there single trees stood by the wayside. In peacetime, the laborers must often have rested beneath them. They had an air of enchantment, standing in solitude, covered with blossoms of white or pink or red. It seemed that the war had thrown a heroic and melancholy light over the landscape, and without disturbing its loveliness, added a ray to its brightness and a strength to its spell. It is easier to go into battle in the midst of such beauties of nature than when surrounded by a dead and cold winter landscape. Somehow, it comes to one quite simply that one's existence is part of an eternal circuit, and that the death of a single individual is no great matter. On the 30th of May, this idyll came to an end as far as I was concerned, for the command of the 4th Company was taken over again by Lieutenant Vogely, who had come out of the hospital. I rejoined my old 2nd Company, now under the command of a cavalry lieutenant, in the line. Our front, extending from the Roman road to the so-called artillery trench, was held by 2 platoons. The 3rd, with company headquarters, was about 200 meters to the rear behind a small hill. There was a little wooden hut there, too, that I used to occupy with Lieutenant Kuss, peacefully relying upon the poor shooting of the English artillery. One side of it was built into the slope of a little hill facing the enemy. The 3 others trustingly offered themselves as a mark. Every day, when the morning's greetings came hurtling across, the following dialogue might be heard between the occupants of the upper and lower bunks. "That you, Ernst? They're shooting, aren't they? Well, let's lie where we are a little longer. I think those were the last ones." And after a quarter of an hour, "That you, Oscar?" "Yes." "They're not going to stop today. I think there was a shrapnel bullet that came through the wall just now. We'd better get up. That artillery observer fellow cleared out long ago." We had always optimistically taken off our boots. By the time we were ready, the shooting had generally left off, and we could seat ourselves happily at the absurdly small table and drink coffee that the heat had turned sour, and light our morning cigars. In the afternoon, in scorn of the English artillery, we used to have sun baths on the ground sheet in front of the door. Our cabin was extremely entertaining in other respects, too. When one lay in sweet idleness on the wire mattress, gigantic earthworms hung pendulum-wise from the earth wall, and shot into their holes with inconceivable rapidity at the least touch. A peevish mole sniffed about from his tunnel, and added much to the enlivenment of our prolonged siesta. On the 12th of June, I had to occupy the outpost on the company front with 20 men. It was late when we left the trench, and we went in the warm evening air by the footpath winding over the undulating ground. Dusk was so far advanced that the red poppies in the untilled fields blended with the vivid green grass to an extraordinarily rich tone. We strolled silently along over the carpet of flowers. Each man was busy with his own thoughts. Our rifles hung from our shoulders, and in 20 minutes we arrived at our destination. In whispers, the post was taken over. Silently, guards were mounted. Then the men we relieved disappeared into the darkness. The outpost rested upon a short, steep hill. In the rear, a wild and tangled wood melted into the night. It was separated from our steep bank by about 100 meters of meadow ground. In front of and to our right rose two hills over which ran the English lines. There was a ruin on one with the promising name Ascension Farm. A sunken road ran between these hills to the enemy. Using a method of advance invented by myself, we crossed two entanglements that barred our way and got over the crest of the hill without, to our surprise, having run into a single outpost. We could now hear English working parties to the right and to the left of us. It was clear to me after this event that the enemy had withdrawn his posts so as not to involve them in the fire which, as I shall explain shortly, he was about to open on ours. My method of advance, mentioned just now, consisted in this, that over ground in which we might at any moment run up against the enemy, each member of the patrol crept forward in turn. In this way, only one man at a time exposed himself to the risk of being shot from an ambush, while the rest, and a body behind, lay in readiness to attack. Naturally, I took care to take my turn as leader, although my mere presence with the patrol was bad enough in itself. An officer in the front line often has to put himself technically in the wrong from considerations of a personal kind. We stalked several working parties that, unfortunately, were separated from us by dense entanglements. The somewhat eccentric sergeant major suggested giving himself up as a deserter and holding the enemy in parley until we had surrounded the first post. This plan was turned down after a brief discussion, and we crept back, disappointed, to the outpost. There I sat down on the edge of the steep bank on my cloak, and, lighting a pipe as cautiously as possible, I gave rein to my thoughts. In the midst of the most beautiful castle in the air, I was suddenly alarmed by a peculiar rustling in the wood in the meadow. In the face of the enemy, the senses are always on the lookout, and it is remarkable that, at such moments, quite ordinary sounds can give one the instant conviction something is up. At the same instant, the nearest post came up to me. "Sir, there are 70 Englishmen advancing to the edge of the wood." I was rather surprised by the numerical precision, but for the sake of prudence I hid myself, with the 4 men nearest me, on the edge of the bank in the long grass, in order to observe how matters developed. After a few seconds, I saw a body of men gliding over the meadow. While the men covered them with their rifles, I called out softly, "Who goes there?" It was Tellengerds, an NCO, an old veteran of the 2nd Company, who was trying to collect his agitated section. I at once got them all in hand and formed them in line, with one flank on the wood and the other on the bank. In a moment, bayonets were fixed. When I was giving them directions and told a man who hung back to dress up with the rest, "I am a stretcher-bearer," was the answer. The fellow had his drill well in his head. Comforted by this triumph of Prussian discipline, I gave the word to advance. While we were crossing the strip of meadow, a hail of shrapnel and a wild clatter of machine-gun fire began from the English side. We broke, against our wills, into a double, so as to reach the cover of the shoulder of the hill that lay to our front. Suddenly, a dark shadow rose in front of me. I seized a bomb and threw it. To my horror, I saw in the flash of the explosion that it was NCO Tellengerds, who had got in front unobserved and had just been tripped up by a wire. Fortunately, he was not hurt. At the same time, we heard the sharper explosion of English bombs not far off, and the shrapnel fire increased to an unpleasant intensity. My firing line broke and disappeared in the direction of the steep bank, which was under heavy fire. I, with Tellengerds and 3 more of the right sort, stood my ground. Suddenly one of them rushed up to me. "The English!" Like a vision engraved for 1 second on my eyes, I saw a double row of kneeling figures, at that moment getting up and advancing over the meadow, which was lit up by only an occasional flash. I could clearly distinguish the figure of an officer on the right flank. Friend and foe were as though paralyzed by this abrupt and unexpected encounter. Then we did the one thing left to us to do. Turned and made off before the enemy recovered sufficiently to fire a shot. We jumped up and ran back to the bank. Though I tripped and fell over a treacherous wire stretched through the tall grass, I got back without further misadventure. The men were there, but they were in a state of great agitation, and it cost me all my energy to get them into line, even elbow to elbow. I have always observed that the ordinary man whose sole preoccupation is his own danger is surprised by what seems to him an undivided attention to the matter at hand on the part of the officer in command, who among 1,001 unnerving incidents of battle yet keeps his eyes fixed upon the execution of his duty. This surprise makes an officer excel himself and spurs him on to always greater achievements. In this way, officers and men call out energies in the other which would otherwise lie dormant. Indeed, the morale factor is everything. The enemy fire ceased of a sudden, and at the same time crackling and rustling sounds were heard in the undergrowth of the wood.
"Halt! Who goes there? Password!"
We kept on calling out for a good 5 minutes, and even shouted the old battle cry of the First Legion, Lutes Lage, an expression signifying schnapps and beer known to every Hanoverian. Only a strange and incomprehensible shout came in reply. At last I took the responsibility on myself and gave the order to fire, though some of the men asserted they had heard German words. The fire of 20 rifles swept the wood, bolts rattled, and soon the cry we heard changed to moans. This gave me a passing twinge of uncertainty. However, there were yellow flashes here and there in our direction, though they soon died away. One of the men was hit in the shoulder, and the stretcher bearers bound him up. "Cease fire!" Slowly the command took effect and the firing ceased. The men had quite recovered their nerve. Once more there were calls for the password, and on my side the persuasive summons, "Come here, you are prisoners! Hands up!" Thereupon there were confused cries from the other side, which were interpreted by the men as, "Rache! Rache! Revenge! Revenge!" A single figure detached itself from the border of the wood and came towards us. One of the men was idiot enough to shout "password" at him, at which he stopped and turned round. "Shoot him dead!" There were a dozen shots, and he sank into a heap beneath the tall grass. This little episode gave us the feeling of satisfaction. Once more confused cries rang out from the edge of the wood. It seemed that the attacking party were encouraging each other to advance on their mysterious enemy. In the utmost excitement, we kept our eyes fixed on the dark strip of ground. It was beginning to dawn, and a light mist rose from the meadowland. Then, a row of shadows rose out of the darkness. 5, 10, 15, a whole lot of them. Trembling fingers released the safety catches. They were 50 meters from us, 30, 15. Fire! For a minute the rattles rattled out. Sparks showered up wherever the storm of bullets encountered weapons or steel helmets. Suddenly there was a shout. "Look out on the left!" Coming quickly on, a party of enemy was attacking us on the left flank. At the head of it was a giant with an outstretched revolver, swinging a white bludgeon. "Left section! Left front!" The men whipped round and received the new arrivals standing. Some of them, and among them their leader, fell at the first hurried shots. Now the moment to attack in turn. With fixed bayonets and a rousing "Hurrah!" we stormed the wood. We threw a volley of bombs into the tangled undergrowth, and in a moment were once more in undisturbed possession of our outposts, without having encountered the pliant enemy. We assembled in a cornfield and looked at each other. Our faces had an after-the-night-before look, and the lark that rose into the sky and began its trills was an added exasperation. We were in much the same mood as when, after a night of play, the cards are flung onto the table and the windows thrown open to let the cool morning air blow away the hanging clouds of cigar smoke. While we handed round the water bottles and lit cigars, we heard the enemy retreating along the sunken road and the cries of the wounded they carried with them. I decided to survey the field of battle. Strange sounds and cries of pain came from the meadow where we had routed the enemy with our rifle fire. We found a number of dead in the long grass, and 3 wounded who begged for mercy. They were convinced we would massacre them. When I asked, "Quel est homme?" one of them answered, "Pauvre Rajput." They were Indians who had come from far over the sea to run their heads against the Hanover Fusiliers in this god-forsaken corner of the earth. Their fine bodies were in an evil plight. At that short range, the infantry fire had an almost explosive effect. Many had been hit for the second time when they had fallen, so that the track of the bullet passed along the whole length of their bodies. Not one had been hit less than twice. We took the wounded up and carried them to our trench. They cried out as if they were being stuck with spears, till the men had to stop their mouths and threaten them with their fists, and at this they seemed to be comforted in their anguish. One of them died while he was being carried in. He was taken on all the same, as there was a prize in the head of every prisoner, dead or alive. The two others strove to win our indulgence by shouting out all the time, "Anglais pas bon," which means English not good. Why these people spoke French, I have never quite made out. The company had heard the sounds of fighting, and had had a heavy barrage put down on them. They welcomed us back to the trench in jubilation and with astonishment at our booty. I retired to our cabin with Cus and a half-dozen more whom he quickly enrolled, and was entertained in honor of the occasion with poached eggs. Our achievement received the notice it deserved, and was mentioned in divisional orders with praise. With 20 men we had beaten back a detachment many times our number, though they had taken us in the rear, and though our orders were to withdraw if attacked in force. Such successes, of course, can only be won by troops whose discipline and morale are of the first order. Of myself, I could say with satisfaction that my command of the situation and my personal influence with my men had prepared a severe disappointment and an early grave for the officer who led the attack. We too had matched our wits in the same way as is customary in field exercises and training, except that we had not used dummy cartridges. If these lines are read by anyone belonging to the 1st Haryana Lancers, I wish to express to him in this place my respect for a body of men who could claim as their commander such a one as he whom I had the honor to fight. What does Nietzsche say of fighting men? You must have enemies only of those whom you hate, but not those whom you despise. You must be proud of your enemy, and then the enemy's success is your success also. The next evening I had orders again to occupy the outpost. It was impossible to occupy it by day, as it was in full view of the enemy. Kiss and I, with 50 men, took each a side of the wood and met at the steep bank. There was nothing to be seen or heard of the enemy, except that there was a shout and a beret light and a shot from the sunken road which Sergeant Major Hackman and I had reconnoitred. We marked this unwary individual down for our next expedition. At this spot where we had beaten off the flank attack the night before were lying 3 dead. 2 of them were Indians, and one a white officer with 2 gold stars on his shoulder straps, a lieutenant, therefore. He had been shot in the eye. The bullet went out through the opposite temple and had smashed the rim of his steel helmet, which is now among my collection of sinister trophies. His right hand still grasped the club, stained with his own blood, his left a large Colt 6-shooter. There were only 2 live cartridges left in the magazine. The men plundered the fallen. I have always hated this sight. All the same, I did not interfere. What they took was otherwise doomed to waste anyway, and aesthetic or moral considerations seemed to me to be out of place in this dark meadow ground over which all the callous restlessness of war still brooded. During the following days, several more dead bodies were found in the undergrowth of the wood. This showed how heavy the enemy's losses had been, and made the outpost a rather unpleasant place to be in. As I was working my way alone through a thicket, I heard a peculiar hissing and murmuring sound. I went nearer and came upon 2 corpses in which the heat had awakened a ghastly life. On the 18th of June, the outpost was again attacked. This time, the affair did not go off so well. The men broke and could not be rallied again. One, an NCO, Erdelt, jumped straight off the bank in the confusion. He rolled down and landed at the bottom among a party of Indians in ambush. He threw bombs, but was soon caught by the throat by an Indian officer and scourged in the face with a wire whip. His watch was taken from him, and he was pushed and thumped and marched off by his captors. However, he managed to escape when the Indians threw themselves down on account of our machine gun fire. After long wanderings behind the enemy's front, he regained our lines, with thick welts across his face. On the evening of the 18th of June, I went out on patrol with little Schultz, 10 men, and a light machine gun. We set out from the outpost, now becoming by degrees somewhat oppressive, with the aim of paying the post that had lately made itself so obvious in the sunken road the honor of a visit. Schultz went with his party to the right of the sunken road, I to the left, with the understanding that if either party were fired on, the other should run to its help. We worked our way forward on hands and knees through the grass and thickets of broom, pausing now and then to listen. Suddenly came the sharp rattle of a rifle bolt. We sank into the ground. Every old hand knows the series of feelings that occupied the next seconds. For the moment, one has lost the initiative and must wait and see what the enemy does next. A shot broke the oppressive stillness. I lay behind my broom bush and waited. On my right, someone threw bombs into the sunken road. At once, a whole line of fire flashed out in front of us. The sickening sharpness of the report showed that the fire came from only a few yards ahead of us. And, seeing that we had stumbled into too hot a corner, I gave the word to run for it. We all sprang up and sprinted for all we were worth, while rifle fire was opened on us from our left as well. I gave up all hope of a safe return when I heard this unholy clattering. Unconsciously, I was in a constant expectation of being hit. Death was out hunting. Somewhere near us, a detachment advanced to the attack with a small hurrah. Little Schultz confessed to me afterwards that he imagined a lean Indian behind him, wielding a knife and already clutching him tight by the neck. I tumbled once and brought down NCO Talengards over the top of me. I lost my steel helmet, revolver, and bombs. Anything to get on. At last we reached the protecting bank and tore down it. Lieutenant Schultz reached it at the same time with his men. He announced quite out of breath that anyway, he had paid out the cheeky outpost with bombs. Just after, 2 men came in carrying Fusilier F, who was wounded in both legs. All the rest were unwounded. The worst misfortune was that the man who carried the machine gun, a recruit, had fallen over the wounded man and left the thing behind. We were holding a brief council of war and planning a second expedition, and the artillery began firing. I was reminded very precisely of the night of the 12th, for this time, too, there was a hopeless stampede. I found myself alone on the bank with the wounded man, who, dragging himself forward by both hands, implored me piteously not to leave him alone. "Don't leave me, sir." I had to, little as I liked it, in order to take my part in putting the outpost in fighting trim. I got the men together in a row of shallow firing positions on the edge of the wood, but I confess I was thankful when the day dawned without further incident. On such occasions I was always surprised and touched by the trusting reliance of the men on the ability of the officer to cope with the situation. "Where shall we go, sir? Help, sir, I'm wounded. Where's the officer?" To be in command at such moments and to have a clear head is its own supreme reward, just as cowardice is its own punishment. I have always pitied the coward, in whom battle arouses a series of hellish tortures, while the spirit of the brave man merely rises the higher to meet a chain of exciting experiences. The next night found us at the same spot. Our object was to recover our machine gun. However, a succession of suspicious noises as we crept on warned us, once more, that there must be a strong detachment on the watch for us. It was decided, therefore, in accordance with a point of honor which, like many others in the war, made us inwardly curse, to recover the lost weapon by force. At 12 midnight, after 3 minutes' artillery preparation, we were to attack the enemy posts and look for the gun. I put the best face I could on the sorry business, and in the afternoon I shot some ranging shots with some of the batteries. At 11 at night I was once more with Schultz, my companion in misfortune, on the uncanny bit of ground where I had already passed so many exciting moments. The smell of corruption was scarcely endurable in the sultry air. We sprinkled the bodies with quicklime that we had brought with us in sacks. The covering of white shone out like graved clothes in the darkness. The Enterprise opened with our own machine gun fire, whistling between our legs and pattering against the bank. On this account, Schultz and I had a violent altercation, for he himself had given the machine gunners their range. We were reconciled, however, when Schultz discovered me behind a bush in close confabulation with a bottle of Burgundy that I had brought with me to invigorate me for the precarious adventure and to calm my nerves, which had been on the stretch for 9 days past. The first shell came along to the minute and landed 50 meters behind us. Before we could express our surprise at this extraordinary shooting, a second was planted close behind us on the bank and showered us with earth. It was not even for me to emit a curse, for I myself had given the range for the guns. After this cheerful opening, we advanced more as a matter of honor than with any great hopes of success. Luckily, the enemy posts had apparently retired. Otherwise, we might have had a very unpleasant reception. Unfortunately, we did not find the machine gun, nor did we search for it for very long. On the way back, Schultz and I once more told each other what we really thought. I about the way he had directed his machine gun fire, and he about the shooting of the guns. I had tested the range so accurately that the affair seemed incomprehensible. Later, I learned that guns always shoot short at night, and that I ought to have added a few 100 meters when I gave the range. Then we sat down to the most important part of the business, the report. We did so well that everyone was delighted. The skirmishing came to an end the next day, for we were relieved by another division. We went back to Montbrun for a time, and marched from there to Cambrai, where we spent nearly the whole of July. The outpost was finally lost on the night following our relief. Langmark. Cambrai is a quiet, sleepy little town whose name calls up many historical associations. The narrow, old-world streets twist about round the mighty town hall, the weathered gates, and the many churches. Ponderous towers rear themselves from a maze of gables. Broad avenues lead to the park, which is adorned by a monument to the aviator Blériot. The inhabitants are peaceful, friendly folk who lead a comfortable bourgeoisie life in the large houses which are simple to look at but richly furnished. Many retired people settle here. The town is rightly called La Villa des Millionnaires, for there were over 40 millionaires there just before the war. The war broke its enchanted sleep with brutal suddenness and turned it into a focus of mighty battles. A new life hurried and rattled over its unevenly paved streets and clattered against the little windows where anxious faces were on the watch. A new life hurried and rattled over its unevenly paved streets and clattered against the little windows where anxious faces were on the watch. Foreigners drank the treasured cellars dry, flung themselves on the great mahogany beds, and upset the contemplative civilians with something fresh every day. Now, in their changed surroundings, they could do no more than collect at corners or in doorways and hold whispered consultations over the latest fairy tales of an eyewitness and the most certain news of the final and speedy victory of their fellow countrymen. The men lived in barracks, and the officers in the Rue des Laniers. While we were there, this street had the appearance of a student's quarter. Conversations carried on from one window to another, nightly sing-songs, and little romantic adventures were the order of the day. We went every morning for training to the great square near the village of Fontaine, which was later to become famous. My job was a very interesting one, for Colonel von Oppen had entrusted me with the training of the storm troop. My billet was extremely comfortable. It was in the house of a jeweler named Plancot-Bourlon, and he and his wife were both very friendly. They seldom allowed my midday meal to pass without sending me up something good from their own table. At night, we drank tea together, played cards, and talked. One of the questions we most often discussed, naturally enough, was the very difficult one: why there had to be wars. On these occasions, Mr. Plancot used to tell stories of the citizens of Cambrai, who were never too busy for a joke. In peacetime, these stories sent streets, wine shops, and markets into roars of laughter, and they reminded me very forcibly of Tiller's wonderful Uncle Benjamin. A wicked fellow once sent to all the hunchbacks of the district, requesting them to call on a certain solicitor with reference to an important inheritance. At the appointed hour, he and some of his friends watched from the window of the opposite house and enjoyed the delightful comedy. 17 outraged and weeping hobgoblins storming the office of the unfortunate lawyer. There was the story, too, of an old spinster who lived opposite, and who was distinguished by a long and slender neck bent strangely to one side. 20 years before, she had been notoriously eager to marry. 6 young fellows presented themselves, and to each she gladly gave the permission to speak to her parents. The next Sunday, a capacious coach drove up in which sat the 6 young men, each with a bouquet in his hand. In terror she locked the door and hid herself, and the suitors delighted the neighborhood by playing the fool in the street. Again, a notorious Cambrisian went to the market and asked a peasant's wife, pointing to a soft, round, and appetizing cheese covered with green mold, "What is the price of this cheese?" 20 sous, sir." He paid her the 20 sous. "So the cheese is now mine?" "To be sure, sir." "And I can do what I want with it?" "Well, of course." Smack! He threw the cheese in her face and fled. On the 25th of July, we left the dear little town and entrained for Flanders. We had read in the papers that an artillery duel was raging there, such as the world had never seen. We detrained in Steden to the distant thunder of guns and marched through the unfamiliar landscape to our camp. On either side of the dead straight road were green and fruitful fields, raised up in plots like flower beds, and luscious, well-watered meadows surrounded by hedges. There were clean farmhouses scattered here and there, with low thatched or tiled roofs, and on the walls bundles of tobacco plants hung out to dry. The country folk on the road were of German type, and their rough speech had a pleasant, homely sound. We spent the afternoon in the farm gardens to avoid being seen from the air. Now and then the shells of heavy naval guns could be heard rushing hoarsely overhead from far back, and then exploding not far from us. A number of men of the 91st Regiment who were bathing in one of the numerous little streams were killed. Toward evening, I had to go with an advance detachment to the front line to prepare for the relief, and we went through Holzhof Forest and to the village of Kuikit, to the reserve battalion. On the way we had to break step once or twice on account of some heavy shells. In the darkness I heard the voice of a recruit. "The officer never lies down." "The man knows what he's about," an older soldier informed him. "Wait till a proper one comes, and he'll be the first to lie down." The men had noticed the principle I always followed: only take cover when it is necessary, and then do it quickly. It is true that only the experienced can judge of the necessity, and feel the end of the shell's trajectory before the recruit has even recognized the light warning whisper in the air. Our guides, who did not seem to be quite sure of themselves, took us along an endless box trench. Such is the name for trenches that are not dug in the ground because the water would stand in them at once, but built above its level with sandbags and fascines. Then we went along the side of a terribly disheveled wood, from which a few days before, according to our guides, a regimental staff had been driven by a small matter of 1,000 24-centimeter shells. Things seemed to be done on a large scale here, I thought to myself. After we had wandered backwards and forwards through thick undergrowth, we came to a halt in a piece of ground overgrown with weeds and fringed by a marshy swamp in whose black pools the moonlight was reflected. Our guide had abandoned us, and all the white shells were falling somewhere and slinging up the mud that splashed back again into the water. At last, the miserable guide returned to receive the full volley of our wrath and to announce that he had found the way. Nevertheless, he again led us astray until we came at last to a dressing station over which shrapnel shells were bursting in couples at short and regular intervals. The bullets in empty cases rattled through the branches. The M.O. on duty gave us a sensible fellow, who took us on to the Mausberg, the headquarters of the reserve line. From there I went straight on to the company of the 225th Regiment that our second company was to relieve. It took me a long search in the shell-pitted country before I found a few ruinous houses that were fortified inside by reinforced concrete. One had been smashed in the day before by a shell, and the occupants lay squashed like mice beneath the fallen roof plate. I spent the rest of the night at the company commander's overcrowded concrete blockhouse. He was an honest front-line swine who, with his orderlies, was passing the time over a bottle of schnapps and a good chunk of pork. With frequent intervals during which he listened to the steadily increasing shell fire and shook his head. Then he would fall to bemoaning the good old days on the Russian front and cursing the way his regiment had been pumped out. At last, I fell asleep. My sleep was heavy and depressed. The HE shells falling all round the house in the pitch darkness evoked a sense of indescribable loneliness and forlornness from the murdered landscape. Involuntarily I nestled up to a man who shared the same bunk. Once I was scared by a heavy thump. My men made a light and looked to see if the wall had been penetrated. It was found that a light shell had exploded against the outer wall. I spent the next afternoon with the commanding officer of the battalion at the Mausberg, as there were still some important points on which I had to be informed. All this time 15-centimeter shells were falling round headquarters, while the captain, with his adjutant and the orderly officer, played an endless game of scat over a soda water bottle full of raw spirits. Sometimes he put his cards down to send off a report, or to discuss very seriously whether our concrete shelter was bomb-proof. We convinced him, in spite of the warmth with which he argued the contrary, the wish being clearly the father of the thought, that we were not fitted to sustain a direct hit from the air. In the evening the customary artillery fire rose to frantic intensity, and in the front line there was an unceasing display of colored lights. Dust-covered dispatch carriers brought in reports that the enemy was attacking. After weeks of drum fire, the infantry battle had begun. I went back to company headquarters and waited there for the arrival of the second company. It appeared at 4 a.m. during a very lively burst of shell fire. I took command of my platoon at once and led it to a position covered with the fragments of a shell-destroyed house, a spot most unspeakably forlorn in the midst of an immense and dreary waste of shell holes. At 6 a.m, the Flanders mist lifted and gave us a glimpse of our ghastly surroundings. At once a swarm of low-flying enemy machines appeared, scrutinizing the battered ground and sounding sirens. Any scattered detachments of infantry that were above ground instantly endeavored to hide themselves in shell holes. Half an hour later, a terrific artillery fire set in. It raged round our refuge like a typhoon-scourged sea round an island. The hail of shells thickened to a throbbing wall of fire. We crouched together, expecting each second the crashing hit that would sweep us up with our concrete blocks and make our position indistinguishable from the desert of craters all around. The whole day passed in bursts of heavy shell fire like this, with pauses during which we prepared ourselves for the next bout. In the evening, an exhausted orderly turned up and handed me an order. From this I learned that the 1st, 3rd, and 4th companies were to counterattack at 10:30, and that the second company, after being relieved, was to swarm into the front line. In order to get a little strength to face the hours ahead, I lay down, never dreaming that my brother Fritz, whom I supposed to be still in Hanover, was in a section of the 3rd Company, and passing close to my hut in a hurricane of fire on his way to the attack. My sleep was disturbed for a long while by the pitiful cries of a wounded man whom two Saxons had brought in. They had lost their way, and were utterly done up and had fallen asleep. When they awoke in the morning, their comrade was dead. They carried him to the nearest shell hole, and after covering him with a few shovelfuls of earth, they went back on their way, leaving one more to be added to the countless lonely and unknown graves of the war. I woke at 11 out of a heavy sleep. I washed in my helmet and sent for orders to the company commander. To my astonishment, he had already gone, without letting me or Kyus or our platoons know anything of it. This showed the consequence of putting officers of another arm in the service and command of frontline troops, only because of seniority, and though they did not even know how to handle a rifle. Let such fetishes be followed when human lives are not at stake. While I still sat cursing on my bunk and considered what to do, an orderly appeared from battalion headquarters with the order to take immediate command of the 8th Company. I learnt that the counterattack of the 1st Battalion on the previous night had been repulsed with heavy loss, and that what was left had taken up a defensive position in a small wood called the Dubshez Wood, and to the right and left of it. The 8th Company had been given the task of swarming into the wood in support. It had, however, run into a barrage in the intervening ground and suffered heavy losses. As the company commander, Lieutenant Budgen, was among the fallen, I was to lead the company on in a fresh advance. After I had taken leave of my orphaned platoon, I made my way with the orderly across country. The desolation lay under a rain of shrapnel, and as we went along half-bent, we were checked by a despairing voice. In the distance, we could see a figure with bleeding arm stumps raising itself from a shell hole. We pointed to the hut we had just left, and hastened on. I found the 8th Company crouching behind a row of concrete positions, an utterly dispirited little mob. Platoon commanders! 3 NCOs came forward and declared that a further advance towards Dubshez Wood was out of the question. It was indeed the fact that the shells were bursting on our front line like a wall of fire. Next, I had the platoons assembled behind 3 concrete positions. Each was about 15 to 20 men strong. At this moment, the fire lifted and came onto us. The scene was indescribable. At the concrete position on the left, the whole section was blown into the air. The right got a direct hit and buried Lieutenant Budgen, who was still lying there wounded, beneath its tons of masonry. We were in a mortar and beaten down by incessant concussions. Faces as white as death stared at each other, and the cries of those who were hit never ceased. It was all the same now whether we stayed where we were or went on or back. So I gave the command to follow me and sprang out into the fire. After just a few steps, I was covered with earth and flung into a shell hole by a shell which fortunately exploded straight upwards. I observed soon after, however, that the fire was not so heavy further on. When I had worked my way forward another 200 meters, I looked about me. There was not a soul in sight. Finally, 2 men emerged from the clouds of dust and smoke. Then 1 more. Then another 2. With these 5 men, I safely arrived at my goal. I found Lieutenant Sandvoss, commander of the 3rd Company, and little Schultz seated in a half-smashed-up concrete pillbox with 3 heavy machine guns. I was greeted with a loud "hello" and a sip of cognac, and then the situation, by no means a pleasant one, was explained to me. The English were close in front of us, and both our flanks were in the air. We cordially agreed that this was a corner too tight for any but old veterans who had grown gray in the smoke of battle. Without a word of warning, Sandvoss asked me if I had heard anything of my brother. My feelings can be imagined when I heard that he had been in yesterday's attack and was missing. A moment later, a man came and told me that my brother was lying wounded in a shelter close by, and pointed out to me a desolate blockhouse covered with uprooted trees. I hurried across a clearing which was covered by rifle fire and went in. What a meeting! My brother lay among a crowd of groaning stretcher cases in a place that stank of death. He was in a sad plight. He had been hit by 2 shrapnel bullets in the attack, one which had pierced the lung and the other his right shoulder. Fever shone in his eyes. It was only with difficulty that he could move or speak or breathe. He returned the pressure of my hand, and we began to talk. It was clear to me that I could not leave him there, for at any moment the English might attack, or a shell put an end to the already damaged concrete shelter. It was a brother's duty to get him sent back at once. In spite of Sandvoss, who would not hear of any weakening of our strength, I ordered the 5 men who had come with me to get my brother back to the Combeside dressing station, and from there to bring back with them men to rescue the other wounded as well. We tied him in a ground sheet and stuck a long pole through it, which rested on 2 of the men's shoulders. I squeezed his hand again, and the sad procession started on its way. From the edge of the wood I watched the swaying load on its way through another wood among towering shell bursts. As each one struck, I caught myself together, though the place where I was no safer. It is odd that another's danger makes a stronger impression than one's own. This may be explained partly by the confidence in his own luck that everyone has. The belief that nothing can happen to himself makes each man underestimate the danger. It is only in another's case that one sees how overwhelming it is and how defenseless the victim. After I had skirmished a little from the shell holes on the forward edge of the wood with the English, who were coming on very slowly, I spent the night with my men in a machine gun section among the ruins of the concrete pillbox. HE shells of quite extraordinary ferocity were going up all the time close by us. In the evening, I was within an ace of being killed by one of them. The machine gun began rattling off towards morning when some figures approached in the darkness. It was a patrol of the 76th Regiment come to get in touch with us. One of them was killed. There were many such mistakes during these days, but it was of no use to dwell on them. At 6 in the morning we were relieved by a detachment from the 9th Company. They brought me orders to occupy the Rattenberg with my men. I had a casualty on the way, a Fahnenjunker wounded by a shrapnel bullet. We found the Rattenberg to be a shell-shot house walled up with concrete slabs. It stood close by the marshy bed of the Steenbeek, which no doubt well deserved its name. Somewhat done up, we entered into possession and flung ourselves down on the straw-covered bedboards. After a good feed and a pipe of tobacco, we felt more ourselves again. In the early hours of the afternoon we were heavily shelled with shells up to the heaviest calibers. Between 6 and 8, one explosion overlapped the other, and the building often trembled at the sickening thump of a dud and threatened to collapse. When the fire ebbed later on, I went cautiously over a hill that was covered in a close and whirring mesh of shrapnel to the Combeside dressing station and asked for news of my brother. The doctor, who was examining the terribly mangled legs of a dying man, told me to my joy that he had been sent back in a fairly promising state. Later in the night, my ration party turned up and brought the company, now reduced to 20 men, warm food, bully beef, coffee and bread, tobacco and schnapps. We ate heartily, circulating the bottle of 98% without any irksome distinctions of rank. Then we turned in, but our rest, owing to the swarms of gnats that rose from the marshy banks of the stream, the shells, and the gas that was shot over occasionally, was not exactly undisturbed. The result was that I was so fast asleep the next morning that after a heavy bombardment had gone on for hours, my men had to rouse me. They told me that men were coming back all the time, saying that the front line had been evacuated and that the enemy were coming on. I first followed the old soldier's maxim, a good breakfast holds body and soul together, and then, after lighting a pipe, went outside to see what was happening. I could not see a great deal, as the surroundings were veiled in a thick haze. The artillery fire was increasing from moment to moment, and soon reached that pitch of intensity which the nerves, incapable of further shock, accept with an almost happy indifference. Showers of earth clattered incessantly on the roof, and the house itself was hit twice. Incendiary shells threw up heavy milk-white clouds, out of which the fiery drops rained on the ground. A piece of this burning stuff came smack on a stone at my feet and went on burning for a good minute. We were later told that men hit with it had rolled on the ground without being able to put it out. Shells with delay action fuses burrowed into the ground, rumbling and pushing out flat disks of soil. Swaths of gas and mist crept over the battlefield, hugging the ground. Immediately in front, we heard rifle and machine gun fire, a sign that the enemy had advanced already. Below, beside the stream, I saw some men walking through a constantly changing scenery of mud fountains shooting high into the air. I recognized the commanding officer, Captain von Brixen, supported by 2 stretcher bearers and with an arm bound up. I hastened towards him, and he called out that the enemy was advancing and warned me not to delay in getting under cover. Soon, the first bullets smacked into the shell holes nearby or were shivered against the broken masonry. More and more fleeing figures disappeared to our rear, while in the front, a storm of rifle fire testified to the embittered defense put up by those who were holding on. It was time to act. I decided to defend the Rattenberg, and made it plain to my men, among whom at this there were some rueful faces, that I had not the remotest thought of retiring. I posted the men at loopholes, and our 1 machine gun was mounted on a windowsill. A shell hole was chosen, and a stretcher bearer, who soon had plenty to do, was installed there. I, too, took a rifle I found lying about, and hung a belt of cartridges round my neck. As my crowd was very small, I tried to get reinforcements from the numbers of men who were passing by in disorder. Most of them obeyed my call willingly, glad to join up, while others whose nerve had gone hurried past after a hasty pause to see that there was nothing to be got from staying with us. In such cases, a tender consideration has no place. "Fire!" I called to the men who stood in front of me in the cover of the house, and a few shots rang out. Overcome by the eloquence of the rifle muzzle, the shirkers, of whom in every battle there must always be some, came slowly nearer, though it was plain from their faces how little eager they were to give us their company. A canteen orderly who I knew well made all kinds of excuses to get away, but I would not let go of him. "But I have no rifle." "Then wait till there's a man shot." During a final crisis of artillery fire, in the course of which the ruins of the house were hit several times and the fragments of brick pattered down on our helmets from high in the air, I was thrown down to the ground in a flash of a terrific burst. To the astonishment of my men, I got up again unhurt. After this wild whirligig of shells, it became calmer. The fire lifted over us and rested on the Landsmark Bixschut road. But we were none the better off in mind, for so far we had not seen the wood for trees. The danger had been so overwhelming that we had no time or power to think of it. Now that the storm had swept on past us, everyone had time to get ready for what was inevitably coming nearer. And it came. The rifles in front were silent. The opposition had been overcome. Out of the haze emerged a thick, advancing line. My men fired, crouching behind the wreckage. The machine gun tacked out. As though they had been wiped away, the attacking line vanished into shell holes and opened fire on us. Strong detachments went on to the left and right. We were soon surrounded by a ring of fire. The position was pointless, and there was no object in sacrificing the men. I gave the order to retire. Now that they had started, it was difficult to make the men give up the fight. Making use of a low-lying cloud of smoke, we got away unobserved, partly by wading above the hips along the stream. I was the last to leave the little fort. Lieutenant Holman, whom I helped along, was bleeding from a severe head wound, though he joked and made light of it as we went. As we crossed the road, we ran into the second company, who had been sent up in support. After a brief consultation, we decided to stay where we were and await the enemy. Here, too, we had to compel troops of other units, who wished to carry out retirements on their own, to remain. Stern measures were necessary to persuade artillerymen and signalers and so on, that even they, in circumstances like these, had to take hold of a rifle and get into the firing line. With the help of Kyus and a few quiet folk, I soon got matters into order by means of entreaties, commands, and blows with the butt end. Then we sat ourselves in a half-dug trench and had breakfast. Kyus pulled out his inevitable camera and took photographs. On the left, there was some movement on the outskirts of Langmark. The men began shooting at some figures that were running here and there until I told them to stop. Immediately after, an NCO came up and reported that a company of the Fusilier Guards were taking up a position on the road, and that our fire had inflicted losses. I gave the order thereupon to advance and occupy the highest part of the road. There was a lively rifle fire. Some of the men fell, and Lieutenant Bartmer of the 2nd Company was severely wounded. Kyus remained at my side and finished his piece of bread and butter as we went. When we occupied the line in the road, whence the ground fell away to the Steenbeek, we saw that the English had been on the point of doing the same. The first khaki uniforms were already within 20 meters of it. As far as the eye could see, the ground to our front was full of troops in line and column. They were swarming round the Rattenberg, too. We made full use of the surprise of our sudden appearance, and at once opened a steady fire on them. Along the Steenbeek, a whole column broke up. One man had a coil of wire on his back, of which he was unrolling one end. Others jumped like hares this way and that, while our bullets raised clouds of dust among them. A sturdy corporal of the 8th Company rested his rifle with the greatest calm on a shattered tree stump, and shot 4 of the enemy, one after the other. The remainder crept into shell holes and lay concealed there till nightfall. We had made a good clearance. At about 11 o'clock, aeroplanes tied with streamers came diving down on us and were driven off by a lively fire, which they replied to from above. In the midst of the wild clatter, I could not help smiling when a man reported to me and desired to have it placed on record that he had shot down a machine in flames with his rifle. Immediately after occupying the road, I had made a report to regimental headquarters and asked for reinforcements. At midday, detachments of infantry, engineers, and machine guns came up in support. According to the time-honored tactics of old Fritz, all of them were crammed into the already crowded front line. Here and there, the English laid out a few of the men who incautiously crossed the road. About 4 o'clock, a very unpleasant bombardment with shrapnel started. The volleys got the road to a T. It was clear to me that the airplanes had ascertained the line on which we were making a stand, and that there were worse times ahead. And, in fact, we were soon being heavily shelled with shells of all sizes. We lay close to one another in the narrow and crowded ditch of the road. Fire danced before our eyes. Twigs and clods whistled about our ears. Close to me on my left, a flash flared out, leaving a white, suffocating vapor behind. I crept on all fours to the man next to me. He moved no more. The blood trickled from many wounds caused by small, jagged splinters. On my right, too, there were many hit. After half an hour it was quiet, and we set to digging out the shallow trough of the ditch so as to have at least protection from splinters in case of a second bombardment. Our entrenching tools came against rifles, equipment, and cartridge cases of 1914, showing that this soil was not drinking blood for the first time. As dark came on, we were given another thorough good do. I crouched behind Kyus in a little hole that had cost us some blisters. The ground rocked like a ship's deck under hit after hit at the least possible distances. We were all ready for the end. I chewed my pipe, my helmet pressed onto my forehead, and stared at the pave whose stones showered sparks under the bursting lumps of metal, and I succeeded in philosophizing myself into courage. The most remarkable thoughts shot through my head. I took a trashy French novel, L'Aventure de la Sierra, that I had picked up in Cambrai, into lively consideration. I repeated several times to myself a saying of Ariosto, "A great heart cares nothing for death when it comes, so long when it may be glorious." It may seem extraordinary, but it helped me to keep control over myself. When the shells gave our ears a little peace, I heard fragments of the beautiful song from the black whale of Ascalon close behind me, and I thought that my friend Kyus must have had a drop too much. Everyone has his own manner of calming his nerves. At the end of it, a large splinter struck my hand. Kyus took out a torch. We only found a scratch. Hours such as these were without doubt the most awful of the whole war. You cower in a heap alone in a hole and feel yourself the victim of a pitiless thirst for destruction. With horror, you feel that all your intelligence, your capacities, your bodily and spiritual characteristics have become utterly meaningless and absurd. While you think it, the lump of metal that will crush you to a shapeless nothing may have started on its course. Your discomfort is concentrated in your ear that tries to distinguish amid the uproar the swirl of your own death rushing near. It is dark, too, and you must find in yourself alone all the strength for holding out. You can't get up and with a blasé laugh light a cigarette in the wondering sight of your companions. Nor can you be encouraged by the sight of your friend clipping a monocle into his eye to observe a hit on the traverse close behind you. You know that not even a cock will crow when you are hit. Well, why don't you jump up and rush into the night till you collapse in safety behind a bush like an exhausted animal? Why do you hang on there all the time, you and your braves? There are no superior officers to see you. Yet someone watches you. Unknown perhaps to yourself, there is someone within you who keeps you to your post by the power of two mighty spells, duty and honor. You know that this is your place in the battle, and that a whole people relies on you to do your job. You feel, if I leave my post, I am a coward in my own eyes, a wretch who will ever after blush at every word of praise. You clench your teeth and stay. All of us held on that evening, all who lay along the dark Flanders road. Officers and men alike showed what they were made of. Duty and honor must be the cornerstones of every army. And a heightened sense of duty and honor must be inculcated in the officer who fights in the forefront of the battle. For that, suitable material and a fixed mold are required. The truth of this is fully known only in war. It began to drizzle after midnight. Patrols of a regiment which had come up meanwhile in support went forward as far as the Steenbeek and found nothing but mud-filled shell holes. The enemy had withdrawn beyond the stream. Worn out by the fatigues of this tremendous day, we got down into our holes, with the exception of the men on guard. I pulled the cloak of my dead neighbor over my head and fell into a restless sleep. As it grew light, I was awakened by a curiously cold feeling and discovered that I was in a sad way. It was raining in torrents and the drainage of the road was pouring into the hole where I was sitting. I built a small dam and bailed out my resting place with a saucepan lid. In consequence of the ever-increasing volume of water, I had to add one course after another to my earthwork, till at last faulty construction yielded to growing weight and a muddy stream gurgled in and filled my refuge to the brim. While I was busy fishing out my revolver and helmet, tobacco and rations were borne away along the ditch, whose other occupants were faring just as I was. We stood shivering with cold and without a dry stitch on our bodies, knowing that when next we were shelled, we had no protection whatever. It was a cheerful situation. And here I permit myself the observation that even artillery fire does not break the resistance of troops so surely as wet and cold. The steady downpour was nevertheless a true blessing in its effects upon the further course of the battle, for the English offensive was just in its first and most critical days. The enemy had to bring up his artillery over a morass of water-logged shell holes, while we had undamaged roads for the transport of all we needed. At 11 in the morning, when we were already desperate, an angel appeared in the person of a dispatch rider who brought the order for the regiment to assemble in Kukyet. We saw on the way how difficult communications must have been on the day of the attack. The roads were packed with men and horses. 12 horribly mutilated horses lay in one heap near some limbers whose wreckage was scarcely recognizable. What was left of the regiment assembled in a rain-soaked meadow over which single bursts of shrapnel opened their white balls. It was a shock to see what was left. A body of about the strength of a company with a small group of officers in the midst. What losses! Of 2 battalions, nearly all the officers and men. The survivors stood in pouring rain with gloomy faces till quarters were assigned. Then we dried ourselves in a wooden hut, crowding round a glowing stove, and got some fresh courage from a hearty meal. Towards evening, shells fell in the village. One of the huts was hit and several men of the 3rd Company killed. In spite of the shelling, we soon lay down to sleep, only hoping that we should not have to counterattack in the rain or be flung without warning into some gap in the line. At 3 in the morning, orders came that we were definitely to be taken out of the line. We marched along the pave to Steden. It was strewn all the way with dead bodies and smashed-up transport. 12 dead lay round the crater of one gigantic burst alone. Steden, that had been so full of life on our arrival, now had many houses shelled, the deserted marketplace heaped up with household goods hurriedly taken out of the houses. One family was leaving the town at the same time as we were. It led a cow as its only possession. The man had a wooden leg, and the woman led a crying child by the hand. The confused din behind added to the sadness of the picture. The remains of the 2nd Battalion were quartered in a lonely farm, concealed behind tall hedges in the midst of luxuriant fields. There I was given command of the 7th Company. Till the end of the war, its fortune and mine were one. In the evening we sat behind an old tiled hearth and refreshed ourselves with a stiff grog, while we listened to the thunder of a battle breaking out afresh. A sentence from the Army communique suddenly met my eyes in a recent newspaper. We succeeded in holding up the attack on the Steenbeek. It felt odd that our apparently confused doings in the depth of night had won a place in history. The enemy offensive, launched with such tremendous force, had been brought to a standstill, and we had a large share in that result. Soon we turned in the hayloft. In spite of the profound sleep in which they were sunk, most of the sleepers tossed to and fro in their dreams, as though they had to fight their Flanders battle over again. On the 3rd of August, we set off on the march to the station of the neighboring town of Gitz. We took much of the cattle and produce of the now deserted neighborhood with us. The whole battalion, in fine spirits again, shrunken though it was, had coffee in the station restaurant. 2 buxom Flemish waitresses added to its flavor and to the general contentment by their bold speeches. The men were particularly delighted when they addressed everyone, officers included, as thou, as it is the local custom to do. A few days later, I had a letter from my brother in hospital in Gelskirchen. He wrote that he was booked for a stiff arm and a shaky leg. I take the following pages from his diary. They wail my own account and give a vivid picture of the impressions made on a young boy who was thrown into the hurricane of modern battle.
Fall in for the attack!
The face of my platoon commander, Sergeant Major Schnell, looked in over the entrance of the little hole covered with branches and boards, where we had lain for hours smoking and eating. The 3 men near me stopped their talk and jumped up cursing. I got up and put on my equipment, set my helmet tight on my head, and went out into the dusk. It was misty and chilly. The scene had altered meanwhile. The shell fire had moved off, and now thundered on other parts of the immense battlefield. Aeroplanes roared through the air and calmed one's anxiously peering eyes with their large iron crosses. I went once more to a spring which was still wonderfully clear in spite of the wreckage and rubbish, and drawing up the bucket I drank and filled my water bottle. The company fell in by platoons. I quickly stuck 4 bombs in my belt and went to my section, from which 2 men were missing. I had scarcely time to write down their names before we moved off. The platoons proceeded in single file over the shell holes, skirting bits of timber, squeezing against hedges, sinking into holes, and making their way with much clatter and rattle to attack the enemy. I knew what my task was. The 2nd Battalion of our regiment and a battalion of another on our flank had orders to drive some English detachments, which had pushed on over the canal, back to the other side again. My orders were to take up a position in advance with my section and lie down in readiness to open the counterattack. While I was going over to see this again, I happened to see the pale, set face of a young NCO, Bachmann, I thought, although I did not know him. It was my comrade, a Fahenjunker likewise in Sandvoss's company. I lost sight of him and looked with astonishment at the scene that had suddenly unfolded. The remains of a large wood, black, branchless, and splintered stumps, stuck up in isolation here and there from the scarred Flanders plain. Immense swaths of smoke drifted through the air and hung the sky with a gloomy, heavy pall. Stinking gases, yellow and brown, hung and swayed heavily to and fro over the earth that the shells tore up so mercilessly again and again. The order was given to be ready for gas. At this moment, a terrific fire came on us like a fit. The soil flew up in fountains, and a hail of splinters swept the ground like a shower of rain. For a moment, everyone stood dazed. Then all broke away like mad. I heard our commanding officer, Colonel Bockelman, bellowing out something, but I could understand nothing. My men had vanished, and I found myself in another platoon. I pressed on with the rest to the wreckage of a village that the shells had razed relentlessly to the very foundations. We pulled out our masks. Without a moment's warning, we were in a terrific machine gun barrage. Everyone threw himself down. Near me, on my left, Lieutenant Ehlers was kneeling up, and near him lay an NCO keeping a lookout. In front there was a yellow, flashing wall of fire. Burst followed burst. Fragments of masonry, showers of soil, brickbats, and splinters rained down on us and struck sparks from our helmets. I stared into this glaring witch's cauldron. Compared to this, what was the half-hour's drum fire that had prepared for this ill-fated attack? For it was as clear to me as a vision that it had failed. Thrice, at short intervals, a tremendous crash swept through the uproar. Whole rubbish heaps took to the air at once, whirled around, and pelted down again with hellish clatter. I looked to my right. Ehlers was shouting something. He raised his left hand, beckoned over his shoulder, and with a shout, sprang forward. I got up heavily and followed at the double. My feet were burning like fire after the night before, but my socks had soaked up the blood, and the pain was not so sharp. I had not gone 20 steps when the flash of a shrapnel blinded me as I struggled up out of the shell hole. It burst not 10 paces in front of me at a height of 3 meters. I felt 2 dull blows against my chest and shoulder. My rifle flew from my hands of its own accord, and I fell backwards into the shell hole. I could still hear remotely Ehlers shouting as he went by, "It's finished him!" He was not to live out another day. The attack miscarried, and in jumping back he was killed and all who were with him. A shot through the back of the head ended the life of this gallant officer. When I woke from a long fainting fit, all was still. I tried to stand up, but I felt a sharp pain in my right shoulder that increased with every movement. My breath was short and gasping. The lung could not get enough air. Hit through the lung and shoulder, I thought, and threw away pack and belt and, in a mood of utter apathy, gas mask too, and hung my water bottle on the hooks of my tunic. After 5 steps, I sank helplessly into a neighboring shell hole. After an hour, perhaps, I made a second attempt to crawl on, as a light drum fire had started. This attempt, too, miscarried. I lost my water bottle and sank into a state of exhaustion, from which after a long time the sensation of burning thirst aroused me. It began to rain gently. I succeeded in collecting a few muddy drops in my steel helmet. I had lost all sense of direction. There was a thunderstorm, but its peals were lost in the new onset of drum fire. I clung close to the side of the shell hole. A clod struck my shoulder. Heavy splinters swept over my head. Gradually, I lost all sense of time. Once 2 men appeared, hurrying by with long strides. I called to them, but they disappeared in the mist like shadows without hearing me. At last, 3 men came straight towards me. I recognized the middle one was the NCO of the day before. They took me to a little hut nearby. It was crammed with wounded, whom 2 orderlies were seeing to. I had lain 13 hours among the shell holes. In a corner I saw Bachman, who convulsively clasped his shattered knee and swallowed down his agony. We spoke in fragments. Now and then, when anyone pushed against him, he suppressed a groan. All the while the artillery fire kept at the same pitch. Shell after shell burst close to us, often covering the roof with sand and earth. My wounds were dressed, and I was given a new mask and a piece of bread spread with coarse red jam and a little water. The orderly looked after us like a father. The English began to push forward. They came on by springs and then disappeared into shell holes, as I could make out from the cries of consternation outside. Then my company commander, Lieutenant Sandvoss, came in. He asked me if I could walk, and then was called away by an orderly and vanished. Immediately I heard him giving orders. A machine gun was mounted and began to tack out. Suddenly, a young officer smeared in mud from his boots to his helmet, with the Iron Cross of the First Class on his breast, rushed in. It was my brother, who days before, down the line, was said to be dead. We greeted each other, smiling rather awkwardly in distress of our feelings. After a minute or two, he left me and came back with the last 5 men of his company. I was put in a ground sheet and carried away from the battlefield to the thunder of guns. Regneville. On the 4th of July, 1917, we got out of the train at the famous Mars-la-Tour. The 7th and 8th companies were quartered in Doncourt, where for some days we lived an almost contemplative life. The only source of conflict for me was the shortage of rations. It was strictly forbidden to forage in the fields, and yet the military police brought me reports nearly every morning with the names of men they caught potato lifting by night. I had to punish them for the crime of being caught, as it stood in my perhaps unofficial code. I had to learn, too, during those days, that wrongdoings never come to any good. Tebe and I had brought with us a princely Lord Mayor's coach from an abandoned Flemish mansion, and had contrived to include it in the transport unobserved. Now we planned a magnificent expedition to Metz, in order to taste life at the full once more. So we harnessed up one afternoon and drove off. Unfortunately, the coach had no brakes, since it was designed for the Flemish plain, not for the hills of Lorraine. Before we were out of the village, we had already begun to roll, and soon found ourselves embarked on a mad career that boded no good. The first to jump for it was the coachman, then Tebe, who fell full length on a heap of agricultural implements, and lay there. I remained alone on the silken upholstery, but certainly not at my ease. A door flew open and was knocked straight off by a telephone pole. Finally, the coach leapt down a bank and crashed against the wall of a house. I left the wreckage by a window and ascertained that, with my unusual luck, I was none the worse. On the 9th, the company was inspected by the commander of the division, Major General von Busse, who praised us for our conduct in the recent fighting. We entrained on the next afternoon for the neighborhood of Tharcourt. Thence we marched straight on to our new position in the line. It lay along the wooded heights of the Côte Lorraine, opposite the much-shelled village of Regneville. It was the first time for a long while that we had the French opposite us. The trench walls were of chalk, and this withstood the weather much better than the clay we were accustomed to. In places, the sides of the trench were even carefully walled, and the floor of it concentrated for long stretches, so that even in the heaviest rain the water would soon run away. The reddish-white rock abounded in fossils. Every time I went to my dugout with a pocketful of mussels, starfish, and snakestone. My dugout was deep and drippy. It had a peculiarity very little to my liking, though I am a passionate entomologist. Instead of the usual louse, we had here its far livelier relative. These two varieties appear to have the same enmity to each other as the brown and common rat. It was no good adopting the usual remedy of a change of clothes, for the nimble parasites lay in ambush in the straw palisades. At last the victim leapt up in desperation, and could have said with Mephisto, "I give the old rug another shake, and still one more to flight does take. Up and away with all my soul, go find yourselves another roll." Rations, too, were very poor. Beyond the thin midday soup, there was nothing but the third of a loaf, and something infinitesimal to eat with it, usually half-moldy jam. Most of mine was always eaten by a fat rat, for which I often lay in wait, but in vain. This sparse living, which left us always half-fed, brought about a most unpleasant state of affairs. The men often suffered, literally, from hunger, and this led to pilfering of rations. It surprised me to find that I, though used to good and plentiful food, seemed to bear the privation much better than the men. Cabbage soup was their only thought. When it comes to food, the good manners that in Europe are mostly whitewash are soon scratched off. A man shows his real superiority when hunger is part of the meal, not at festive tables. Privation and danger tear away all that has been acquired, and then good form survives only in those in whom it is born. The companies in reserve and on rest occupied hutments in picturesque situations deeply hidden in the forest. My quarters in reserve were particularly delightful. The camp was in a blind corner on the edge of a narrow forest gorge. My little hut was half built into the bank, and curtained with hazel and cornel bushes. From the window I had a view of the wooded hillside opposite, and a narrow strip of meadow traversed by a stream. A collection of bottles of all sorts stacked at the back showed that many hermits had already spent meditative hours here, and I, too, strove to live up to its time-honored associations. When the evening mist rose from below and mingled with the heavy white smoke of my wood fire, I squatted in the open door at dusk between the warm fire behind and the keen autumn air in the front. It always seemed to me that only one drink was appropriate: red wine and cognac, half and half, in a big-bellied glass. These intimate communings consoled me for the fact that a gentleman from the depot, who had seniority over myself, had come to take over my company, and that I was once more discharging the boring duties of a platoon commander in the trenches. I endeavored to kill the endless hours on trench duty by frequent warlike excursions in my old style. On the 24th of August, the gallant Captain Bockelman was wounded by a shell splinter. This made the third commanding officer the battalion had lost within a short time. On the 29th, with the NCO Klopman, the stoutest fellow of the 7th Company, I paid a visit to the enemy lines. We crept up to a gap in the enemy wire, cut by Klopman the night before. It was an unpleasant surprise to find that it had been mended up again. Nevertheless, we cut through once more, with a great deal of noise, and climbed down into the trench. We crouched behind the next traverse and listened, lying in wait. After a quarter of an hour we went cautiously on, following a telegraph wire that came to an end at a bayonet stuck in the ground. We found the post defended by wire entanglements of all kinds, and also a trellis door, but unoccupied. After we had taken accurate note of everything, we went back the same way, and carefully connected up the wire again across our gap, so as not to betray our visit. The next evening Klopman again reconnoitred the post. However, he was greeted by rifle fire, and the lemon-shaped bombs we called duck's eggs. One of them fell close to his head, which was pressed to the ground, without exploding. He had to take to his heels with all speed. The evening after that there were 2 of us again, and this time we found the front line occupied. By listening, we accurately located 4 posts. One of them was whistling a very charming tune to himself. Finally, we were fired on, and crept back. When I was standing by myself in the trench again, Vogt and Haverkamp suddenly turned up. They had very obviously been having a jolly time, and the odd idea had come to them of leaving the comfortable reserve camp and journeying through a pitch-black night to the front line, in order to go, as they said, on patrol. I have always made it a rule to let anyone carry his own skin to market where he pleases, so I made no objection to them clambering out of the trench, though the enemy still continued in a high state of excitement. It is true that the sole purpose of their patrol was to look for the silk parachutes of French rockets, and that, having found them, they chased each other to and fro in front of the enemy's wire, whirling these white tokens aloft. Naturally, they were fired on, but after a long while they came happily back. Bacchus had them in his tender keeping. On the 10th of September, I went for the reserve camp to regimental headquarters to ask for leave. "I have been thinking of you," was Colonel von Oppen's reply. "However, the regiment has to make a raid in force, and you are to lead it. Look out the best men, and get them into training down in Solivet camp." We were to enter the enemy's trench at 2 points, and endeavor to bring prisoners back. The patrol was in 3 parties, 2 for attack, and 1 to occupy the front line and cover our rear. I led the left party, Lieutenant von Kienitz to the right. The men were all volunteers, and a few who were not required nearly wept when I left them out. My party, myself included, consisted of 14 men, and among them were Feinrich Siglitsky, the NCOs Klopman, Mavis, and Dufskin, and 2 pioneers. The most reckless fellows of the 2nd Battalion found themselves united. We trained ourselves in bomb throwing for 10 days, and carried out our enterprise against a carefully built model of the strong point we were to raid. It was a wonder, considering the excessive zeal of the men, that I had only 2 wounded with bomb splinters before the event. For the rest, we were excused all duty, so that when on the afternoon of the 22nd of September we proceeded to the second line, where we were to spend the night, I found myself in command of a somewhat wild but very useful band. In the evening, von Kienitz and I made our way through the dark forest to regimental headquarters. We had been invited to a farewell dinner by the commanding officer of the battalion, Captain Schumacher. After that we lay down to sleep in our deep dugout. It is a peculiar feeling when, knowing that next morning you have a fight to the death to go through, you give yourself a last audience before you fall asleep. We awakened at 3, and we got up and washed and had breakfast made for us. I got into a temper at once because my batman had over-salted and so ruined the poached eggs. I had treated myself too, both in honor of the day and for my own support. We pushed back our plates and went through for the 100th time every detail and contingency. At intervals, we offered each other cherry brandies, and von Kinnitz gave us the benefit of several time-honored jokes. At 20 minutes to 5, we got the men together and led them to the jumping-off places in the front line. Gaps in the wire had been cut, and long arrows, whitened with lime, pointed to our objectives. We separated with a shake of the hand and waited for what should come next. I was in full array, 2 sandbags in front of my chest, each with 4 stick bombs, the left-hand one having instantaneous, the right hand with time fuses. In the right-hand pocket of my tunic I had an .08 revolver on a long cord, and my right pocket a small Mauser pistol. In my left tunic pocket 5 egg bombs, in the left trouser pocket a phosphorescent compass and a policeman's whistle. In my belt spring hooks for pulling out the bomb pens, a dagger, and wire cutters. There was a pocketbook in my breast pocket, and my home address, and in the pocket of the back of my tunic, a flat flask full of cherry brandy. We had taken off our shoulder straps and Gibraltar badges so that the enemy should have no information as to our unit. We wore a white band round each arm so as to know each other. 5 minutes before 5, the division on our left opened fire as a blind. Exactly at 5, our artillery and trench mortars suddenly opened out. I was standing with Klopman in front of the dugout entrance and smoking a last cigar. We had to take cover, however, as many of the shells fell short. Watch in hand, we counted the minutes. Exactly at 5:5, we left the dugouts and made for the prepared gaps in our wire. I ran forward, holding a bomb aloft, and in the half-light I saw the right-hand party rushing on to the attack. The enemy wire was poor, and I jumped over it in 2 bounds, but I fell over a tripwire behind it and tumbled into a shell hole. Klopman and Mevius pulled me out. In! We jumped into the front line without meeting opposition, while from our right came the sounds of a bombing engagement. Without worrying about that, we crossed by the sandbag barricade that blocked the next trench, and jumped from shell hole to shell hole till we came to a double row of knife rests that separated us from the second line. As this trench was in a state of confusion and gave no hope of prisoners, we hurried on without pausing down a communication trench. It was blocked, so I sent the pioneers forward to clear the way, but time being short, I took the lead myself. At the junction of the third line, the red glow of a cigarette end fell to the ground in front of me. I gave the men a signal, grasped my bomb tighter, and crept warily along the well-built trench, against whose walls leaned any number of abandoned rifles. At such a moment, the memory unconsciously fastens upon the most trifling objects, and now the sight of a saucepan with a spoon in it where the 2 trenches crossed was imprinted on my mind. To this fact, I owed my life 20 minutes later. Suddenly, we saw shadowy figures disappear in front of us. We ran after them and came to a sandbagged sap in whose wall was the mouth of a dugout. I went forward and shouted, "Montez!" A bomb was the only answer. Apparently it was one with a time fuse. I heard the little snap and had time to jump back. It burst at the height of my head against the opposite wall, tore my silken cap, wounded my left hand in several places, and tore away the top of my little finger. The pioneer sergeant standing near me had a hole bored through his nose. We retreated a few steps and bombarded the danger spot with bombs. One of us, in an excess of zeal, threw a smoke stick into the entrance and made further attacks on it impossible. We turned back then and followed the third line in the opposite direction, hoping to get a prisoner at last. Arms and equipment had been thrown down everywhere. The question, where were the owners of all these rifles, and where were they lying in wait, made a more and more uncomfortable impression on us. But on we hurried all the same, undeterred, on and on through the deserted trenches, with bombs ready and revolver outstretched. It was only by thinking it out later that I made out our course after this. We had turned without noticing it into a third communication trench, and by this time were well into the middle of our own barrage, and approaching the fourth line. Here and there we pulled open the boxes of bombs built into the side of the trench, and stuck a bomb in our pockets as a keepsake. After we had gone to and fro and up and down, trenches running parallel and across, no one had any longer the least idea where we were, nor in what direction the German lines lay. By degrees, we all got the wind-up. The needles of our compasses danced in our hands, and when we looked for the pole star, all we had learned at school evaporated and left us in the lurch. The sound of voices in the next trenches warned us that the enemy had recovered from the shock of surprise. He would be bound soon to realize our position. After turning about once more, I suddenly saw, as I brought up the rear, the muzzle of a machine gun waving to and fro over a traverse of sandbags. I made a jump at it and came upon Klopman and Feinrich Ziglitsky busy with the gun, while Fuselier Haller was searching a blood-stained body for papers. Without troubling any more about our surroundings, we began fiddling with the machine gun in a feverish haste so that we might at least take back something with us. I tried to loosen the retaining screws. Another cut off the loading belt with wire cutters. At last we got hold of the thing, tripod and all, meaning to take it with us without dismounting it. At this moment, we heard a voice from the trench running parallel to us. It came from the direction in which we supposed our lines to be. Qu'est-ce qu'il y a? At the same time, a black blob flew over towards us, indistinctly seen against the dim sky. Look out! It burst between Mevius and me, and a splinter got Mevius in the hand. We scattered in all directions, entangling ourselves deeper and deeper in the maze of trenches. With me there was only the pioneer sergeant and Mevius. Our one hope was the Frenchmen's alarm, for they did not venture yet to come out of their holes. However, it could be only a matter of minutes before we ran into a strong party of them, who would do us in with the light. I debated whether I would not simply whack the first one I met on the head with one of the stick bombs that had an instantaneous fuse. There was no thought of a hands up. When I had given up all hope of safely getting out of this wasp's nest, a cry of joy escaped me. My eye had fallen on the saucepan with the spoon, and now I knew my direction. As it was now quite light, we had not a moment to lose. We jumped out of the trench and made for our own lives over the tops, as the first bullets whistled round us. In the French first line, we came on Lieutenant Von Kintz's party. When the cry of "L'outelage" rang out, we knew we had the worst behind us. Most unfortunately, in jumping into the trench, I came right on a man who was severely wounded and lay in the trench among the others. Kinitz hurriedly told me that he had bombed a French working party in the front line and had driven it back, and that at the very start, when advancing further, he had suffered losses in dead and wounded from the fire of our own artillery. After waiting a longish while, two more of my party turned up, the NCO Jezevskin and Fuselier Haller. Haller brought me at least some small consolation. He found himself in his wanderings alone in a little sap, and there he had discovered 3 abandoned machine guns, one of which he had unscrewed from its stand and brought with him. Now, as it was growing lighter every moment, we hurried over no man's land into our own front line. Of the 14 men who had gone out with me, only 4 came back, and Kintz's patrol, too, had heavy losses. I was very crestfallen, but some words of the worthy Oldenburger, Dujevskin, cheered me up a little. He was recounting his experiences to a group of men in front of the dugout where I was having my hand dressed, and he concluded by saying, "But Lieutenant Younger has won my respect. Lads, you should see him clear the blocks." Then we got together again and marched through the forest to regimental headquarters. Colonel von Oppen gave us coffee. He was very much disappointed at our lack of success, but he expressed his admiration all the same for what we had done. Then I was put into a car and driven to the division, which required exact information. A few hours before, I was storming shell-shot trenches and forlorn bombing attacks. Now I enjoyed to the full the luxury of leaning back in a powerful car as it purred along over a good road. The general staff officer received me in his office, and tried in vain to impress upon me that I owed the loss of my men to an ill-considered and over-hasty advance. I thought, you can tell me a lot, sitting here 20 kilometers behind the line, and I gave him to understand that in the enemy's front line, I had neither a green table nor the pack of cards upon it. Besides that, all the part I had had was the fighting itself. As for the plan, that had been thrust upon me ready-made, though there was much in it to take exception to. I had asked that the objective should be altered to the well-marked line of the paved road, or at least that colored lights might be fired from our lines in case any of us lost our way. The reply had been that this would draw the enemy's fire. But what the devil did the enemy's fire matter to me? I was used to it. But I was not an owl to see my way in the dark. The divisional commander was more agreeable, and soon dissipated my low spirits. I sat next to him at lunch in my torn tunic and with my hand bound up, and remembered the saying, "Only fools are modest." I took care to put our doings of the morning in their true light. Next day, Colonel von Oppen inspected the patrol again, and distributed iron crosses, and gave each of us our 14 days' leave. At midday, those of the fallen who were brought in were buried in the military cemetery at Thiaucourt. Among these years' graves are some of 1870 to 1871. One of these old graves is a mossy stone with the inscription, "Far from our sight, but always near our hearts." Cut on a large tablet of stone were the following lines: "Heroes' deeds and heroes' graves rank themselves beside the old. How to win and how to keep, here is told." In the evening, I read in the French communiqué, "A German raid near Regneville has failed. We made prisoners." It was not stated that the prisoners were taken only because we lost our way in seeking an enemy who had fled before us. Had the French defended their trenches as soldiers of courage do, it would have been a different story. I had a letter some months later from one of the missing, Fusilier Meyer. He had lost a leg in a fight with bombs. After long wanderings, he and 3 others had been engaged by the enemy. When the others, among whom was the brave N.C.O. Klopman, had fallen, he himself had been taken prisoner, severely wounded. I have been in many adventures during the war, but not one was more uncomfortable. It gives me the blues even now whenever I think of our wanderings through those unknown trenches in the cold light of dawn. A few days afterwards, Domeyer and Zern, both lieutenants, jumped into the French front line with a few men and no more preparation than a few shrapnel shells. Domeyer ran into a French soldier, who replied to his "rendezvous" with a grim "ah non," and set upon him. After a stern tussle, Domeyer shot him through the neck with his revolver, and had to come back, like me, without a prisoner. The difference was that for my attempt, as much ammunition was shot away as would have sufficed for the entire battle of 1870. Flanders, again. On the very day that I came back from leave, we were relieved by the Bavarian Infantry Reserve Regiment No. 5. We then went into quarters in Le Bray, a village in the neighborhood dirty enough to be typical of it. The The vain search for a water closet is the outstanding memory one has of the villages of Lorraine. Baths appear to be unknown. I have had some strange experiences of this description in France. One has to pass with a smile over certain shady sides of even the most magnificent mansions. Much as I esteem the French, I cannot help thinking that this is a characteristic side of their life. I know indeed that hostile races always call each other dirty, and that we ourselves are called the sales boches by the French. Nevertheless, I feel we are fully justified in returning this compliment to the Latin races. On the 17th of October, 1917, we were entrained, and after a day and a half, trod the soil of Flanders once more, after an absence of 2 months. We spent the night in the little town of Isgem, and the next morning marched to Roulers, or in Flemish, Rouselaire. The town was in the first stages of devastation. Things were still for sale in the shops, but the inhabitants were already living in their cellars, and the ordinary life was lost in the streets, being broken up by frequent bombardments. A milliner's window opposite my billet seemed to me to be very much out of place in the tumult of war. By night, looters tried to break into the houses of those who had already left. I was the only person in my billet in the Oosterstraat to occupy rooms above the ground level. The house belonged to a cloth merchant, who had fled at the beginning of the war and left an old housekeeper and her daughter to look after it. They took care of a small orphaned girl whom they had found during our advance, forsaken by her parents and wandering in the streets. They knew neither her name nor her parents. They had an extreme fear of bombs, and besought me, almost on their knees, to have no light upstairs, in case of attracting the hateful bombers. However, I found I had laughed once too often. I was standing with Lieutenant Reinhardt at the window and watching an English machine skim low over the roofs in the beam of a searchlight. Suddenly, an immense bomb burst close by, and the window panes burst into splinters above our ears. I was appointed intelligence officer in the coming operations, and attached to the regimental staff. To get my bearings I went, before we took over, to the headquarters of the 10th Bavarian Reserve Regiment that we were to relieve. I found the CO very friendly, though at first he growled something about my red band. By that time, I had long given up attaching any importance to a war-worn uniform. The new hand is known everywhere by other tokens than these. 2 orderlies took me to the so-called Meldelkopf, which was said to give a very good view of the front. We had scarcely left headquarters when a shell fell near us. I was still, apparently, to be the well-beloved son of chaos. Towards midday, the shells came over in an incessant thunder, but my guides cleverly avoided them by the course they took across a country that was marked by numerous little poplar plantations. They worked their way forward through the lovely autumn landscape, with the instinct of the soldier of modern warfare, who even in the heaviest fire can hit on a path that offers at least even chances. We arrived at a lonely farm, where there were signs of recent shell bursts. At the yard gate, a dead man lay face downwards. "Settled him," said one of the sturdy Bavarians. "Dirty weather," said the other, and hurried on after a look at the sky. The Medlikopf lay on the far side of the much-shelled Passchendaele-Westerspiekke road. It was an intelligence clearing station like the one I had had in my charge at Fresnoy. Situated near a house that had been shot to a heap of rubbish, it was so little protected that the first honest hit would blow it to pieces. 3 officers were leading a sociable cave life there, but they were very much delighted by the prospect of a speedy relief, and gladly told me all I wanted to know about the enemy, and the front, and the approaches to the line. After this, I returned to Rulers by the way of Rudkris and Ustenwerke, and made my report to the commanding officer. As I went through the streets of the town, I read the homely names of the numerous little inns that express the snug Flemish life so well. Who would not be drawn by a signboard with the title, Die Zalm, salmon, Die Reaper, heron, Die Neue Trompet, Die Drei Koningen, or Den Oliphant? Does it not echo Tenares and De Coster? At the very outset, one is put at one's ease by the homely speech and the confiding Du. May this enchanting country get back to its old life again after the frightful wounds of war. In the evening, the town was bombed once more. I went down to the cellar and found the woman huddled in a corner. I turned on my electric torch to comfort the little girl. She was crying for terror in the dark, for a bomb had extinguished the light. Here was another sign of the tenacity with which people cling to their homes. In spite of the violence of their fear, these women embraced the very soil that might at any moment be their grave. On the morning of the 22nd of October, I started for Calve with my troop of 4 men. It was here that the staff of the regiment was to take over in the course of the morning. There was very heavy shelling on the front, and the flashes gave the early morning mist the appearance of an effervescent blood-red vapor. A house at the entrance of Ustenwerke was hit by a heavy shell and collapsed with a roar when we were not far from it. Bits of stone rolled along the road. We tried to make a detour, but had to go through the towns as we did not know the way by Rudkris. As I was hurrying by, I asked the way of an NCO who was standing at a cellar entrance. Instead of replying, he dug his hands into his pockets and shrugged his shoulders. I had no time to lose, considering the shells that were coming over, so I leapt upon this blunder of military education and extorted the information at the point of my revolver. This was the first time I ever found anyone in the fighting area who made difficulties, not from cowardice, but just because he wanted to. Though this state of mind naturally grew more general in the last years of the war, yet such an expression of it in the course of operations was extremely unusual, since battle is like an opiate whose immediate effect is to stimulate the nerves, though the subsequent effect is to deaden them. On the other hand, it was when marching out of the line after a show that you found the clearest indications of crumbling morale. Matters became more serious round Rudkris, a small farm at a fork in the road. Limbers were going like mad along the shelled road. Infantry wound in file through the fields on either side of it, and a string of wounded dragged themselves along to the rear. A young artilleryman had a long, jagged splinter sticking out from his shoulder. We turned off the road to the right to regimental headquarters, which were in a ring of shell fire. 2 signalers were laying telephone wire in a field of cabbages nearby. A shell went up close beside one of them. We saw him fall, and took it he was finished. However, picking himself up with an admirable sang-froid, he continued unrolling his wire. As headquarters were no more than a tiny concrete blockhouse, where there was scarcely room for the commanding officer and his staff, I had to seek quarters elsewhere. With the intelligence, gas, and trench mortar officers, I shared a flimsy wooden hut that was scarcely the ideal of a bomb-proof shelter. In the afternoon I went up the line, as a report had come in that the enemy had that morning made an attack on our 5th Company. My way took me over the Meldkopf to Nordhof, a farm shelled out of all recognition, beneath whose ruins dwelt the commanding officer of the battalion in reserve. Thence a track that was still just to be discerned led to the CO of the troops in the line. The vast fields of shell holes had been turned into a sea of mud by the heavy rain of the last days. Its depths were particularly dangerous in the low-lying field of the Padvik. On my zigzag course I passed many a lonely and forgotten corpse. Often only a head or a hand projected from the shell hole whose circle of dirty water reflected them. Thousands sleep like that, without one token of love to mark the unknown grave. I crossed the pad beak after the utmost exertions, and only with the help of some poplars that a shell had flung across it, and found the officer in command of the 5th Company, Lieutenant Hines, in a great shell hole with what remained of his company around him. Their shell hole line lay on a slope, and since it was not entirely flooded, might be called habitable by the unassuming frontline soldier. Hines told me that the English had come on in line that morning, but had disappeared when fire was opened on them. The enemy had, however, shot a few men of the 164th Regiment who had lost their way and ran for it at their approach. Apart from this, all was in order, and I returned forthwith to headquarters and made my report to the commanding officer. On the following day, we were most rudely interrupted at lunch by a few shells planted right in front of the door. Descending fountains of soil beat long tattoos on our tarred roof. There was a rush for the door. I fled to a farm close at hand, and as it was raining, I went inside. In the evening, the same performance was repeated, only this time, as it was fine, I stood outside the farmhouse. The next shell fell right in the middle of it. Such are the chances of war. Here, more than anywhere, it is a case of little causes and great effects. Seconds and millimeters make the difference. On the 28th, we were driven from the huts by 8 o'clock, and one of those opposite us got a direct hit at the second shot. Others fell in the waterlogged meadows. They made less noise, but they scooped out some fine holes. Prompted by the experiences of the day before, I sought out a lonely shell hole, of dimensions to inspire confidence, in the cabbage field behind headquarters, and I would never leave it again until a considerable safety margin had elapsed. I heard that next day the news, particularly distressing for me, of the death of Lieutenant Brecht. He had met his heroic death in the shell hole area to the right of Nordhoff, while acting as a divisional observation officer. He was one of the few who were encircled by a nimbus of romance, even in the most material of wars, owing to their insatiable daredevilry. Men like him always stood out from the common run. They laughed every time an attack was ordered. The morning of the 26th was occupied by drum fire of unusual intensity. Our artillery, too, doubled its fury when the signals for a barrage went up in the front line. Every little bit of wood and every hedge was crammed with guns, and behind them the half-dazed gunners were kept hard at work. As the reports of the wounded about an English attack were confused and exaggerated, I was sent forward at 11 with my 4 men to obtain more exact information. We had to pass through a sharp fire, and met a great number of wounded. Even before reaching the headquarters of the battalion in the line, we were in a direct machine gun fire, a sign that the enemy must have broken through. This fear was soon confirmed by Major Dietlein, the commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion. I found the old gentleman in the act of creeping out of the entrance of his blockhouse, which was 3 parts under water, and fishing zealously for his meerschaum cigar holder, which had fallen into the mud. The enemy had broken through the front line and taken a ridge from which he commanded the important area of the pad beak, and battalion headquarters situated there. After I had marked the alterations of the front line in blue chalk on my map, I set out on a fresh steeplechase through the mud with my men. We ran at full speed over the exposed ground till a slope gave us cover, and then we proceeded more slowly to Nordhoff. Shells were falling to the left and the right of the boggy ground, and throwing up large mountains of mud surrounded by countless smaller ones. Nordhoff was being shelled with HE in a nerve-shattering manner, and we had to reach it in jumps. The noise these things made was really most hideous and quite deafening. They came over in groups at short intervals. The only thing to do was to cover the ground in short darts, and then wait for the next shots in the shell hole. The interval between the first distant howl and the explosion nearby is marked by a peculiarly painful emphasis upon the instinct of self-preservation, since the body is reduced to a state of defenselessness and motionless waiting. But I am afraid my insistence on the fact that the war was no child's play will become burdensome. The picture of every day was at last made up of such experiences. There was shrapnel, too, among the rest. One of them scattered its bullets with a clatter among us, and one of my men was hit on the hind rim of his helmet and thrown to the ground. After he had laid stunned for some while, he picked himself up and ran on. The ground round Nordhoff was strewn with terribly mutilated bodies. As we carried out our job in a sporting spirit, we were often in places that had just ceased to be possible. In this way, the unseen events of the battlefield came to our eyes. We were everywhere, pressing on the heels of death. It was almost as though not one living soul was to be found in this desolation. Here lay a group behind a tattered hedge, their bodies covered by the still fresh earth that showered on them after the shell had burst. There, 2 runners near a shell hole, from which the suffocating vapor of the explosives still exhaled. At other spots, there were many corpses scattered over a small surface. A carrying party caught in a vortex of shell bursts, or a strayed platoon coming up in support, had found an inn here. We appeared, took in the drama at one glance, and disappeared into the smoke again. When we had safely crossed the much-shelled bit of ground behind the Passchendaele-Westbeek road, I was able to give intelligence to the commander of the regiment. Next morning I was dispatched to the front line at 6 o'clock to ascertain whether and where the regiment was in touch with the units on its flanks. On the way I met Sergeant Major Furchland, who had taken the orders to the 8th Company to advance on Goodberg and fill the gap, if there should be one, between us and the regiment on the left. The quickest way to carry out my task was to go along with them. After a long search we found my friend, Tebe, commanding the 8th Company, in an inhospitable part of the shelled area near Metalkopf. He was not particularly pleased at the notion of executing the proposed movement in broad daylight. We lit cigars while waiting for the company to assemble, and conducted a laconic conversation in the dreary and oppressive surroundings that the morning light revealed. Before we had gone a few steps, we were under rifle fire from high ground in front, and we had to go forward by jumps from one shell hole to the other, each man on his own. As we went across the next rise, the fire was so concentrated that Tebe gave the order to take up a position in shell holes until night came on. Smoking his cigar, he went with great coolness along the whole length of his front. I decided to go on and ascertain the width of the gap, and first I rested a while in Tebe's shell hole. Soon, the enemy artillery began to resent the company's imprudent advance, and got the range of the strip of ground we were on. A bit of shell that struck our refuge, throwing the soil over my map and into my eyes, gave me the tip to go. I bade farewell to Tebe, and wished him good luck for the hours ahead. He called after me. God send the night. The morning will come of itself. We made our way cautiously through the low-lying ground of the Padbeek, which was overlooked by the enemy, taking cover behind the branches shot away from the poplars and using their trunks as a bridge. Now and then, one of us sank in mud above the hips, and would certainly have drowned but for the rifle butts that the others stretched out to help him. I chose as our objective a group of men standing round a concrete blockhouse. In front of us, mobbing in the same direction, there were 4 stretcher-bearers carrying a stretcher. It made me suspicious to see a wounded man being carried forward, so I took my glasses and then saw a line of khaki-colored figures with flat helmets. At the same moment, the first shot snapped out. As there was no cover to take, we ran, and the bullets spurted the mud up on all sides of us. The chase through the morass was frantically exhausting, and when completely pumped, we had to stop a while and give the English a good target. but a few HEs soon restored us to our first vigor. All the same, they had the advantage of concealing us from the enemy in their smoke. The worst feature of this run was knowing that a wound would drown one for certainty in a mud hole. A suffusion of blood on the surface of a shell hole here and there showed that many a man had vanished thus. I was dead tired when we reached headquarters. I gave my sketch and made a report of the situation. On the 28th of October, we were relieved again by the 10th Bavarian Reserve Regiment and quartered among the villages behind the line, to be put in again at any moment. The staff moved to Most. In the evening, we were sitting in a deserted inn. We were already in the best of spirits again, and celebrating the promotion of Lieutenant Zern, who had been mentioned in dispatches and had just come back from leave. As a punishment for our lightheartedness, we were awakened next morning by gigantic drum fire that blew in my window panes in spite of our distance from it. Immediately after, the alarm was given. There was a rumor that the enemy had broken through by the gap that still persisted on the regiment's left flank. I spent the day waiting for orders at the artillery observation post, the neighborhood of which was being sporadically shelled. A light shell went through the window of a small house and drove out 3 gunners, wounded and covered with brick dust. The corpses of 3 others remained beneath the wreckage. The morning after, I had the following orders from the commanding officer of the Bavarians. Owing to repeated attacks by the enemy, the front of the regiment on the left flank has been still further pushed back, and the gap between the regiments greatly widened. As there was danger of our flank being turned from the left, the 1st Battalion of the 73rd Fusiliers counterattacked yesterday. Apparently, however, it was dispersed by the barrage and never reached the enemy. This morning, the 2nd Battalion was sent forward to close the gap. So far, no news has been received. Information is now required as to the position of the 1st and 2nd Battalions. I set out, and had only got as far as Nordhof when I met Captain von Brixen, commanding officers of the 2nd Battalion, who had a sketch map of the disposition of the troops ready to hand in his pocket. I took a copy of it, and with this my task was really completed. However, I went on all the same to the headquarters of the troops in the line, which I found in a concrete blockhouse, in order to make a personal reconnaissance. On the way I passed great numbers of recent casualties. The white faces stared out of the brimming shell holes, or were already so mud-bespattered that the human face was scarcely recognizable. I was sorry to see the blue Gibraltar badge on most of them. The commanding officer was a Bavarian, Captain Radelmeyer, a very energetic officer. He gave me full details of the position that Captain von Brixen had hastily told me of. Our 2nd Battalion had suffered heavy losses, among them the adjutant and the officer commanding the valiant 7th Company. The fate of the adjutant, Lieutenant Lemire, was particularly tragic, as his brother had been killed the April before at Fresnoy in command of the 8th Company. Both brothers belonged to the Principality of Liechtenstein, but they had joined the army out of enthusiasm for the cause of Germany. It is fatal for 2 sons to be in one regiment in wartime. We had 4 pairs of brothers among the officers of the regiment. Of these 8, 5 were killed, and 2, one of whom was my brother, was severely wounded. I was the only one to come through in a fairly sound state. This little example shows the losses of the Fusiliers. The captain pointed to a concrete post about 200 meters in front of our line, which had been defended with particular heroism the day before. Shortly after the attack began, the commander of this little strong point, a sergeant major, saw an Englishman who was taking off 3 German prisoners. He shot the Englishman and added the 3 to the strength of his garrison, though it did not appear that he found in them an exactly heroic trio. When they had shot away their ammunition, they tied an Englishman in front of the entrance as a peaceful signboard, and at dark succeeded after all in escaping unobserved. Another strong point, commanded by a lieutenant, was summoned to surrender. Instead of making an answer, the German leapt out and, seizing the English officer, dragged him inside before the eyes of his bewildered men. That day, for the only time in the war, I saw small bodies of stretcher-bearers moving about in the open with the Red Cross flag, without a shot being fired. Such a sight was unknown to the front-line soldier in this subterranean war, except when matters were very desperate. Nevertheless, I heard later on that some of our stretcher-bearers had been shot by English snipers. This fact may seem astounding, and yet I can explain it to myself. Weak natures are prone to the atavistic impulse to destroy, and it takes hold of the trench fighter in his desolate existence when anyone appears above ground. I have felt it myself only too often. I had an unpleasant time on my way back owing to the irritant gas of the English shells. The ground was saturated with it. It smelt of rotten apples and made the eyes run. After making my report to headquarters, I met 2 stretchers just outside the dressing station at Calv. On each, severely wounded, was an officer whom I knew well. On one was Lieutenant Zern, and whose honor we had made a night of it only 2 evenings before. Now he lay half undressed on a door. His face had that hint of yellow which is the certain precursor of death, and he looked at me with fixed eyes when I went up to take his hand. The other, Lieutenant Haverkamp, had the bones of a leg and an arm so shattered by a shell that an amputation was extremely probable. He was as white as death, and he lay on his stretcher with his features heroically set, smoking a cigarette. Our losses in young officers were again frightfully heavy during those days. Every time afterwards that I heard prejudice and deprecation on the lips of the mob, I thought of these men who saw it out to the bitter end with so little parade and with so fine of an ardor. But after all, what is the mob? It sees in everything nothing but a reflection of its own manners. It is quite clear to me that these men were our best. However cleverly people may talk and write, there is nothing to set against self-sacrifice that is not pale, insipid, and miserable. On the 3rd of November we entrained at Gitz, whose situation was familiar to us from our earliest Flanders days. We found that the 2 Flemish girls had lost their old freshness. They, too, seemed to have lived through days of battle in the meantime. Next, we were for some days in rest at Torking, an imposing sister city of Lille. For the first time and the last during the war, every man of the 7th Company slept on a feather bed. I occupied a magnificently furnished room in the house of an industrial magnate known as the Rue de Lille. The first evening, with an open fire, the indispensable marble mantelpiece, and an armchair, was unspeakably delightful. The few days were passed by everybody in enjoying life that had been so hardly won. It was still scarcely believable that death had been escaped, and it seemed a necessity to assure oneself of it by enjoying life in every aspect.